Your Excellencies, Vice Rector, Dean, distinguished colleagues and friends, a very warm welcome to this special conference on obtaining justice and reparations for survivors of genocide, which is organized by the Embassy of France to the Netherlands under the framework of the French Presidency of the European Union. It's a true privilege to welcome you on behalf of Leiden University to our premises here in The Hague. And we are very grateful to serve as host of this important occasion, and I think it speaks to the importance of the topic that despite the beautiful weather outside, we just have such a great attendance today. We will start the day with opening remarks by His Excellency Louis Vassy, the Ambassador of France to the Netherlands, and then we have two opening presentations by our wonderful Nobel Prize laureate, Nadia Murad, our guest of honor, and by Mr. Eamon Gilmore, the European Union Special Representative for Human Rights. This will then be followed by three substantive panels on the role of the United Nations in the prevention, establishment, and reparation of genocide, the role of international courts and tribunals in relation to atrocity crimes, and also the role of domestic jurisdictions. And then finally, a panel on support and reparations for survivors. We will conclude with closing remarks by the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Mr. Mark Rutte. Before I give the floor to Ambassador Vassy, I would like to make just three brief organizational announcements. First of all, some of our speakers will address you in French. We've therefore provided headphones to secure interpretation into English. So please, if you think you need interpretation, just grab one of these headphones and make use of it. The second remark is that the event will not be live streamed, but it will be recorded. The third remark is on timing. We are tied to a very strict timetable in light of the excellent themes and speakers. And this is why we only have a 5-minute break between the panels. So it's a little bit more a leg stretching break rather than a true coffee break. And we will, of course, have more time for exchange at the reception. So without further ado, I now have the honor to pass the floor to Ambassador Vassy. Monsieur l'ambassadeur, vous avez la parole.
Merci beaucoup. Chère Nadia Murad, prix Nobel de la paix, je viens d'apprendre avec vous il y a quelques minutes que ceci était votre première visite aux Pays-Bas et je dois dire que je suis particulièrement honoré qu'elle se réalise à l'invitation de l'ambassade de France. Cher Eamonn Gilmore, représentant spécial de l'Union européenne pour les droits de l'homme, Monsieur le recteur, Mesdames et Messieurs les ambassadrices et les ambassadeurs, juges, procureurs, membres des juridictions internationales, représentants de la société civile, chers étudiants et chers amis. Permettez-moi tout d'abord de remercier l'ensemble des panélistes de très haut niveau qui ont accepté d'être présents parmi nous aujourd'hui. Leur participation à nos échanges témoigne en elle-même de la maturité atteinte par le système de la justice pénale internationale. En quelques générations, des cours, une jurisprudence, un cadre normatif ont été développés au niveau international et dans l'ordre juridique interne d'un nombre croissant de pays. Ils forment un édifice chaque jour plus solide et dont la nécessité est comme une évidence. C'est en soi, pour nous tous, un succès. Permettez-moi également de remercier Carsten Stan et l'Université de Leiden qui nous ouvre aujourd'hui son campus de La Haye pour ce bel événement. Et enfin, permettez-moi de remercier mes propres équipes qui ont travaillé d'arrache-pied pour la réalisation de cet événement depuis plusieurs mois et afin qu'il puisse être un succès. Grâce à vous tous, a pu naître un projet finalement naturel. Que la présidence française du Conseil de l'Union européenne soit l'occasion d'un échange sur la justice et la réparation du crime de génocide. Si l'histoire de l'Europe ne se résume évidemment pas à cela, il va également de soi que la volonté viscéralement ancrée dans chaque Européen d'éviter que ne se reproduisent les crimes indicibles du XXe siècle, le génocide des Juifs d'Europe et avant lui celui des Arméniens, est un élément central de notre vie morale et de notre volonté de créer sur notre continent un espace de paix. À La Haye, ce dialogue que nous allons avoir prend évidemment un sens particulier. Nous sommes ici dans la ville du droit international, siège des grandes juridictions chargées de rendre la justice pénale internationale. Siège également de la Cour internationale de justice, saisie lorsque la manipulation de la notion de génocide au titre de la Convention de 1948 devient un prétexte à une agression armée d'un pays contre son voisin souverain, l'Ukraine. C'est bien sur le continent européen qu'a été utilisé pour la première fois le terme de génocide dans le cadre d'un procès, celui de Nuremberg. C'est en Europe, en France, qu'a été adoptée la Convention de 1948. C'est en Europe qu'est né Raphaël Lemkin, celui à qui nous devons le concept lui-même. En tant qu'Européens, nous sommes donc les dépositaires d'une histoire spécifique. Mais la composition de nos panels rappelle le caractère universel du défi que nous avons à surmonter. Du Moyen-Orient, où la communauté yézidi fut la cible de ce que le ministre français des Affaires étrangères, Jean-Yves Le Drian, avait qualifié en son temps de projet génocidaire de Daesh, et que Karim Khan, qui nous fait l'honneur d'être parmi nous, a reconnu comme tel l'an dernier devant le Conseil de sécurité. Au Rwanda, dont Serge Bramertz a encore à connaître en tant que procureur du mécanisme résiduel pour les tribunaux pénaux internationaux, le mal sait partout surgir. C'est peut-être sur ce dernier point que je voudrais conclure à l'adresse des plus jeunes d'entre nous. Toute injustice nous indigne, et cette capacité d'indignation est saine. Lorsque nous l'exerçons, nous devons toujours, pour autant, garder à l'esprit que toutes les injustices ne se valent pas. Dans un univers, notamment lié aux réseaux sociaux, où tout nous invite à réagir avec vigueur, le risque n'est jamais loin que s'indigner de tout finisse par nous amener à nous indigner de rien. Si tout est également grave, rien ne l'est plus. Et cette dynamique ne joue qu'en faveur des auteurs des crimes les plus graves. Aujourd'hui, nous entendrons parler ceux qui ont eu à traiter des crimes parmi les plus terribles que l'humanité ait pu connaître, et nous le faisons à quelques heures de vol d'un pays, l'Ukraine, qui est le théâtre de crimes d'une immense gravité, sur lesquels la justice aura à se prononcer. Nous devons à leurs victimes de conserver en nous une part supplémentaire de révolte et d'être à leur côté, tant pour lutter contre l'impunité que pour les aider à reprendre le cours de leur vie. Je vous remercie tous de votre présence et j'ai l'honneur de céder la parole à Nadia Murad.
It's now a distinct honor to give our honorary speaker, Ms. Nadia Murad, Nobel Prize winner of 2018, the floor and president of the Initiative for the Rights of Survivors of Sexual Violence. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador, for organizing this event. My friend, Mr. Karim Khan, respected panelists, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining in this important discussion. Today, we gather for a day against impunity. But in reality, ending impunity for genocide and war crimes cannot be achieved in a day. It requires steadfast commitment and sustained action. In forums like this, it can be far too easy to talk about genocide in the abstract. But my presence here is evidence of the fact that it affects real people. Genocide is not simply a concept of international law for my community of Yazidis in Iraq. It is a present reality that cannot be escaped for thousands of women and children still in ISIS captivity. It is the ongoing source of suffering for hundreds of thousands of Yazidis who are still displaced from their homes. It is the grief of families whose loved ones remain in mass graves. Genocide is a history we sadly share with many communities in the past and present day. I wish the list of groups affected by genocide was short enough for me to recite, but it is tragically long and still growing. How do we stop this list from expanding even more? By showing with our actions and not just our words, with actual prosecutions and not just laws, that genocide will not be tolerated. Because it is not just faraway minorities that are affected by genocide. By definition, genocide is a crime against all of humanity. Genocide destabilizes regions and forces people out of their homes and across oceans. We are all less safe when people think that it's okay to target, rape, and kill others because of their identities. The existence of people different from you is not a threat to your way of life. But genocide is a threat to the international system we rely on for peace and prosperity. What I hope to convey is that the international community should not focus on what tools we do and do not have for prosecuting genocide. We need to focus to immediately employing the tools we have to take every possible action as quickly as possible. We cannot wait for genocide to end before acting. We must gather evidence and pursue justice faster than perpetrators can take lives. Justice is not a resolution after a crime is committed. It is an action that can be used to end the crime from continuing. It has been almost 8 years since the Yazidi genocide began. ISIS was defeated, but the process of genocide that they started has not ended. Genocide is the undoing of a people, not just through death, but through the destruction of the things we need to survive and pass on our culture to the next generation. ISIS deprived Yazidis of clean water, electricity, homes, schools, temples, and bodily autonomy. They stopped us from raising our children in our faith and heritage. These things were not automatically restored when ISIS lost control of Sinjar. That is why justice cannot just be about perpetrators. Genocide cannot be ended by locking up criminals. It is ended by supporting survivors, by reinvesting in and rebuilding communities so that they have the tools to survive, so that they cannot be eradicated. For Yazidis, that means providing multiple paths to safety and recovery. One of these paths is restoring basic services in Sinjar and supporting survivors of sexual violence with the basic resources to heal and restart their lives independently. This requires stable governance and security in Sinjar. But the disputes over control of Sinjar are not just right now threatening Yazidis' recovery, they are once again threatening our lives. The international community, and especially the UN Security Council has a responsibility to maintain peace and security, facilitate the resolution of this conflict, and ensure that Yazidis have a meaningful say in the future of our homeland. Having a day in court is also a concrete part of survivor recovery. In legal cases, we have to involve and respect the wishes of affected survivors in every step, from investigation to prosecution. The recently published Murad Code defines best practices for working with survivors to document sexual violence. These guidelines should be incorporated into all legal processes. Survivors deserve to see that our rights and existence matter. Last year, a German court convicted an ISIS member for genocide. It was the first time this had ever happened anywhere in the world. This historic verdict is an important step, but it is not enough. As we speak, other terrorist groups and oppressive regimes are watching as ISIS members openly brag about enslaving Yazidi women while facing few, if any, legal consequences. Today, over 2,800 Yazidi women and children remain missing in captivity. Their enslavers regularly post online to buy and sell them like cattle. For captives, nothing has changed in the past 8 years. The international community has expressed outrage but has not created a plan for their search and rescue. Now is the time to act, to rescue them, to rescue Yazidi women and children and put ISIS on trial for genocide and sexual violence. The international community can send the Yazidi case to the International Criminal Court or establish a hybrid court by treaty to prosecute ISIS's crimes. Individual governments here in Europe can follow Germany's example and use the principle of universal jurisdiction to try war criminals for the atrocities they commit, including sexual violence. So next year, on this day, I want to be back here at The Hague, but respectfully, I don't want to be speaking at another event about impunity. I want to be testifying at a trial against ISIS perpetrators. So thank you so much for coming and listening.
Thank you so much, Ms. Murad, for your moving and touching remarks. You really stand, I think, as an example of civil courage, and the message you gave us is crystal clear. We have to act, we have to change the conditions affecting the lives of people. That is what The Hague stands for, and this is where we need conjoint actions of different courts, national, international, regional, to move forward. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Eamonn Gilmore, the European Union Special Representative for Human Rights. Thanks so much, Mr. Gilmore, for joining us here in The Hague today. It's a great honor that you join us.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador, Rector, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great privilege to be here in Leiden University and I want to thank the French Presidency of the Council for organising this important conference. Genocide is the ultimate denial of humanity. It is a horror that seeks to destroy someone because they are deemed to be worthless as a human being. It is when the unimaginable becomes a reality. And the outstanding courage shown by you, Nadia, calls for outrage, for indignation, but above all, as you have said, for justice and the restoration of dignity for victims and of hope for those who still live in fear. Human rights are not abstract. They are for everyone and they are universal. They belong to people everywhere and in every country of the world, and no one has the right to deny another person his or her rights or to deem them not worthy of rights. They are inherent in the dignity of every human being. And today, when we look around the world, we are confronted with millions of people who fear for the security of their own lives every day. In recent times, we have witnessed an avalanche of crises and conflicts: Syria, Yemen, Ethiopia, Ukraine, and many more. And the threats of atrocities, crimes against humanity, and genocide is still alive, which makes the world's first ever human rights treaty, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, just as important today as it was in 1948. Nadia said that impunity cannot be addressed in a day. And genocide does not just happen overnight. It is a process, and prevention is crucial. There are always warning signs. And in the past, I have to say that the international community has not always acted when it should. But we must act on these signs immediately, and we can never afford to delay. Disinformation and fake news fuel hatred against minorities, and it is essential that all actors, political, legal, business and tech leaders, heed these early warnings and raise the alarm. Through our own blueprint for action on human rights, the European Union Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy, we strongly combat any kind of intolerance, harassment or violence against any person or community based on ethnic origin, religion or belief. The EU and its member states also use conflict analysis tools and the EU early warning system to act as soon as possible. At the UN World Summit in 2005, UN member states unanimously committed to protect populations from atrocity crimes. The responsibility to protect argues that while states or governments have the primary responsibility for protecting their own people from mass atrocity crimes, the international community also has a shared responsibility to prevent and to protect people from the most heinous atrocity crimes. And that is why the European Union will continue to strive to enhance action on the responsibility to protect. Justice is essential for the realisation of human rights, for the preservation of peace, and for the construction of a healthy democratic society. It is crucial to our security and our stability. And that is why accountability is critical. It is central to reconciliation and non-recurrence. I doubt that Milosevic thought that he would ever face a court or face a tribunal in The Hague when he was committing his war crimes. People who are responsible can be held to account no matter how long it takes. States have a duty to hold perpetrators to account, to prevent genocide and mass atrocities, and this duty starts at home. Since 2002, the European Network of Contact Points in respect of persons responsible for genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes ensures close cooperation between national authorities in investigating and prosecuting atrocity crimes. And when states fail in this duty and they need assistance in fulfilling it, they can rely on the International Criminal Court. The ICC stands as the world's only permanent independent court for the investigation and prosecution of the most serious crimes. The Court demonstrates the international community's resolve to end impunity and to foster a culture of accountability. And the European Union has been a strong supporter of the Court since its creation, and we will continue to strongly push for the universality of the Rome Statute. Accountability also means not forgetting. As we move from one crisis to another, it is our duty to keep alive the attention to the human rights agenda in many countries, after the cameras have moved on to the next crisis. In our external work, the European Union seeks to prevent violations and abuses of human rights throughout the world. We do this because it is also in our interest. More justice means human rights protection and greater freedom, prosperity, peace and security for us all. And where violations and abuses occur, to ensure that victims have access to justice and redress and that those responsible are held to account. The European Union will keep working with national and international partners, including civil society, to prevent genocide and impunity around the world. The late, great Desmond Tutu once said, "As much as the world has an instinct for evil and is a breeding ground for genocide, Holocaust, slavery, racism, war, oppression and injustice, the world has an even greater instinct for goodness, rebirth, mercy, beauty, truth, freedom and love. So we must always focus on what unites us, our shared pursuit of peace and prosperity, with the promotion and protection of human rights at the centre, enriched by our diversity. And never let us forget that what can happen when we deny our common humanity." It's a great privilege to be with you today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gilmore, for reminding us that human rights are not abstract, and for reminding us also of the accountability of not forgetting, I think, which is particularly crucial if we look at the many atrocity situations that we see around the world. You also provided, I think, a transition already to our next panel, to the theme of genocide. We will contemplate now the role of UN bodies in the prevention, establishment and reparation of genocide. And the UN has a long history in this. This panel will be moderated by Professor Muriel Ubeda-Sayar, who is Professor in International Law and former Vice President for Legal Affairs at the Université de Lille. And we have the honor and the privilege to welcome Judge Gilbert Guillaume, former President of the International Court of Justice and Judge ad hoc, Ms. Alice Wairimu Nderitu, the UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, and Prosecutor Sergey Brummets of the International Residual Mechanism for International Criminal Tribunals. So I would invite our next panel to take a seat here on the podium to proceed. So please give a big welcome to our panelists.
Alors, sans plus tarder, puisque nous avons pris un petit peu de retard sur le déroulement du programme, je tiens à remercier évidemment Monsieur l'ambassadeur Vassy pour son invitation et pour l'organisation de cette conférence internationale qui soulève évidemment des enjeux majeurs. Je remercie aussi les services de l'ambassade de France pour leur efficacité, leur grande amabilité, notamment Mesdames Hélène Petit et Charlotte Touzeau-Ménoni. Je dirais quelques mots pour introduire la question du rôle des organes des Nations Unies dans la prévention, l'établissement et la réparation du génocide, à laquelle est consacrée cette première table ronde, avant de céder la parole aux 3 prestigieux intervenants qui s'installent et avec lesquels j'ai l'honneur de participer donc à ce panel. En premier lieu, je crois qu'il faut rappeler l'implication originelle de l'Organisation des Nations Unies dans la lutte contre l'impunité du crime de génocide. La Convention pour la prévention et la répression de ce crime constitue en effet le premier traité de protection des droits de l'homme qui fut adopté par l'Assemblée générale des Nations Unies dans l'immédiate après-guerre, le 9 décembre 1948, c'est-à-dire la veille de l'adoption de la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme. 2 ans auparavant, le tribunal militaire international de Nuremberg n'avait exercé sa compétence qu'à l'égard des crimes de guerre, crimes contre la paix et crimes contre l'humanité. Le génocide ne relevait pas de sa compétence. Cependant, la poursuite des crimes contre l'humanité avait mis en évidence des actes qui traduisaient l'intention de détruire tout ou partie d'un groupe national, ethnique, racial ou religieux, un groupe ciblé précisément en raison de ses caractéristiques propres. C'était notamment le cas des actes qui participaient de la solution finale mise en œuvre par le Troisième Reich. Ces actes criminels étaient caractérisés par l'existence d'un dol spécial. Et il présentait au demeurant un caractère particulièrement ignominieux. Alors, il n'existe pas de hiérarchie entre les crimes en droit international pénal, mais le génocide a pu être qualifié de crime des crimes du fait de l'opprobre qu'il suscite. Parce que la masse des victimes massacrées et les moyens mis en œuvre pour leur élimination traduisent évidemment l'inhumanité absolue des responsables, indépendamment de leur triste banalité qui a été théorisée, comme chacun le sait, par Hannah Arendt. Par conséquent, en 1948, c'est bien l'incontournable promesse du « plus jamais ça » qui anime les États membres des Nations Unies, des États qui sont soucieux de démentir les propos de Hegel, selon lesquels, je cite, « Ce qu'enseignent l'expérience et l'histoire, c'est que peuples et gouvernements n'ont jamais rien appris de l'histoire et n'ont jamais agi selon des maximes qu'on aurait pu en tirer. » Immédiatement après l'adoption de la Convention de 1948, l'Assemblée générale va donner par conséquent mandat à la Commission du droit international pour consolider et développer l'œuvre judiciaire de Nuremberg, et ce, en 3 volets. D'une part, codifier les principes de droit international consacrés par le jugement de Nuremberg. D'autre part, élaborer un projet de code des crimes contre la paix et la sécurité de l'humanité. Et enfin, réfléchir à la création d'une cour criminelle internationale qui était mentionnée par l'article 6 de la Convention sur le génocide. La Commission du droit international va s'acquitter des 2 premiers mandats, en 1950 et 1954, mais pas du 3e, parce que alors l'Union des Alliés avait fait long feu. La guerre froide aiguisait les souverainetés et les temps n'étaient plus au développement d'un multilatéralisme harmonieux. 54 ans plus tard, qu'en est-il de la prévention et de la répression du crime de génocide par les organes des Nations Unies. Je me contenterai évidemment dans ce second point de proposer un cadre très impressionniste et de suggérer quelques pistes de réflexion sans empiéter sur les communications des intervenants de ce panel. Il me semble d'abord que les Nations Unies ont souhaité tirer les leçons douloureuses de leur échec des années 90 dans les situations au Rwanda et dans les Balkans. Elles ont donc institutionnalisé le Bureau pour la prévention du génocide et la responsabilité de protéger. Ce bureau, et je parle sous le contrôle de la conseillère spéciale du secrétaire général, Madame Wairimu Nderitu, promeut une démarche préventive qui me semble intégrale. Intégrale parce que le bureau déploie un ensemble de mesures destinées à éviter la commission d'actes de génocide selon deux axes. D'une part, via une vigilance à l'égard des signes précurseurs dans une situation donnée, de manière à déclencher le mécanisme d'alerte rapide. D'autre part, à travers un travail pédagogique de sensibilisation et de diffusion de la connaissance. Cette prévention est renforcée et complétée par l'établissement des responsabilités qu'évoqueront le président Guillaume et le procureur Brammertz, responsabilité internationale de l'État et responsabilité pénale des individus. Parce qu'en effet, la justice, c'est un élément clé de la pacification, des reconstructions collectives et individuelles des sociétés et des victimes, mais son temps est long, comme on le sait. Et la détermination de l'existence juridique d'un génocide est une question grave, une question complexe. L'attente peut susciter, comme on le voit aujourd'hui en Ukraine, des sentiments d'impatience, voire d'injustice. Pourtant, je crois que c'est avec rigueur et prudence qu'il faut qualifier les faits de manière à limiter les effets contre-productifs que pourrait avoir une qualification prématurée, telle que par exemple, en tant qu'effet contre-productif, la tentative d'instrumentalisation des exceptions au principe d'interdiction du recours à la force. De ce point de vue, les nouveaux mécanismes de recueil des preuves qui sont créés depuis les initiatives en Syrie, en Irak, au Myanmar ou en Ukraine, afin d'établir la matérialité des faits, me paraissent constituer une avancée majeure. Et à vrai dire, on aimerait que les mêmes mécanismes existent dans d'autres situations qui impliquent des États membres permanents du Conseil de sécurité, comme la situation des Ouïghours ou, dans le passé, des Tibétains. Aujourd'hui, en 2022, le génocide ne devrait plus être une question d'actualité. Le génocide devrait être un chapitre terrifiant des livres d'histoire qu'on enseigne dans le souci d'un devoir d'inventaire. Sa prohibition fait partie des normes de jus cogens en droit international. Elle donne lieu à des obligations erga omnes. Bref, elle concrétise l'existence d'un ordre public international dont il faut espérer à l'avenir qu'il se consolidera. En tout cas, il faut l'espérer pour les populations dont les gouvernements piétinent littéralement leur pacte social. Et pourtant, et je pense que le président Guillaume en dira un mot, c'est tout le paradoxe du droit international que d'assortir les obligations impératives de sanctions dont l'effectivité semble inversement proportionnelle à l'importance des valeurs que ces obligations protègent. Parce que ces obligations présentent le plus souvent le défaut pour le droit international, d'échapper au schéma traditionnel de la réciprocité et d'être des obligations non bilatéralisables. Les Nations Unies vont par conséquent devoir continuer à faire preuve d'audace, d'imagination, dans leur manière de créer puis d'appliquer le droit international. Et il me semble, de ce point de vue, que l'Union européenne peut constituer un précieux partenaire. C'est ainsi que je conclus ces propos introductifs. Je vais céder immédiatement la parole au président Guillaume, tout en précisant que j'exercerai mes fonctions de modératrice avec diligence, une diligence souriante, mais stricte, quant au respect du temps imparti à chacun, de manière à ce que notre table ronde se termine à l'horaire prévu. Monsieur le Président, vous avez la parole.
Comment ça marche?
Je pense que ça fonctionne. Vous pouvez y aller.
Vous m'entendez? Oui. Bien. Eh bien, écoutez, permettez-moi de commencer par le commencement. Le commencement, c'est que le terme de génocide a été créé en 1944 par Raphaël Lemkin dans son ouvrage « Axis Rule in Occupied Europe ». L'auteur de cette reconnaissance reconnaissait qu'il s'agissait là d'un concept nouveau, pour lequel il proposait donc un mot nouveau, celui de génocide, forgé très bizarrement à partir d'un terme grec, génos, le peuple, et d'un verbe latin, caedere, ce qui est un mode de construction linguistique un peu bizarre. Mais c'est une remarque tout à fait adventice. Le concept fit son apparition en droit quelques années plus tard par l'adoption de la Convention de 1948 sur la prévention et la répression du crime de génocide à laquelle il a déjà été fait allusion. Cette convention a été ratifiée par 152 États, c'est-à-dire à peu près les 3/4 des États du monde. Ces États se sont engagés à quoi? D'abord à prévenir et à punir le génocide, qu'il soit commis en temps de paix ou en temps de guerre. La Convention précise les conditions dans lesquelles les personnes accusées de ce crime peuvent et doivent être poursuivies ou extradées. L'article 9 dispose que les différends entre les parties contractantes relatifs à l'interprétation ou à l'application de la Convention seront soumis à la Cour internationale de justice. La Cour a exercé cette compétence 5 fois. Pour la première fois, cela a été en 1951, lorsqu'elle a été consultée par l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies et qu'elle a donné un avis à cette dernière. 50 ans plus tard, la Bosnie-Herzégovine et la Croatie, par 2 requêtes distinctes, ont accusé la Serbie d'avoir manqué à ses obligations conventionnelles. Belgrade a répliqué en accusant à son tour la Croatie. Par 2 jugements, rendus en 2007 et 2015, la Cour a estimé que la Serbie avait manqué à ses obligations de prévention dans le cas du génocide commis à Srebrenica. Elle a rejeté les autres conclusions des parties fondées sur la Convention. Plus récemment, la Cour a été amenée, sur la base de ce texte, à indiquer des mesures d'urgence, appelées d'ordinaire mesures conservatoires, au Myanmar en 2020 et à la Russie le 16 mars dernier. De ces diverses décisions se dégage une riche jurisprudence que je vais tenter de résumer très brièvement, en abordant successivement 3 points. Premièrement, quels sont les principes fondamentaux qui ont été posés par la Cour en ce domaine? Deuxièmement, quelle interprétation a-t-elle donnée de la Convention? Troisièmement, quelles sont les solutions qu'elle a retenues pour l'octroi de mesures d'urgence? Principes fondamentaux. 3 principes fondamentaux ont été dégagés par la Cour. Elle a tout d'abord jugé que non seulement le génocide est prohibé par la Convention, ce qui allait de soi, mais encore que les principes qui sont à sa base obligent tous les États, qui soient ou non membres de la Convention. La prohibition ainsi proclamée est, comme vous l'avez rappelé, Madame, une obligation impérative, une norme impérative du droit international. La Cour a par ailleurs limité les possibilités pour les États de formuler des réserves à la Convention qui risqueraient de la vider de tout contenu. Elle a précisé que ces réserves, si elles étaient contraires à l'objet ou au but de la Convention, ne sauraient recevoir application. Enfin, la Cour a précisé que tout État parti à la Convention, même s'il n'est pas spécialement affecté par les manquements d'un autre État, peut faire constater ces manquements par la Cour. La Convention crée des obligations que les juristes qualifient d'obligations erga omnes partes. En d'autres, c'est pour ce motif que la Gambie a pu, par exemple, saisir en 2020 la Cour de la situation du groupe des Rohingyas au Myanmar. Ces principes étant posés, la Cour a été amenée à appliquer et interpréter la Convention. Ce faisant, elle a tout d'abord précisé le sens qu'il devait donner au mot de génocide. Trop souvent, ce terme est utilisé en un sens très large qui ne correspond pas au droit applicable. Selon l'article 2 de la Convention, ce crime suppose d'abord qu'aient été perpétrés certains actes matériels tels que meurtre de membres d'un groupe, atteinte à l'intégrité physique ou mentale de ses membres ou soumission à des conditions d'existence devant entraîner leur destruction physique, mais elle implique aussi que ces actes soient commis dans l'intention de détruire tout ou partie d'un groupe national, ethnique, racial ou religieux comme tel. La Cour a noté que les rédacteurs de la Convention avaient entendu limiter le champ d'application de celle-ci à la destruction physique, et a-t-elle ajouté ou biologique, du groupe visé, excluant ainsi le génocide culturel, par exemple, ou excluant les déplacements forcés de population en tant que tels. La Cour a en outre souligné que le génocide se distingue d'autres infractions voisines, telles que les crimes contre l'humanité ou les crimes de guerre, par la nécessité d'établir une intention, à savoir celle de détruire en tout ou en partie le groupe concerné. La difficulté, évidemment, c'est la preuve d'une telle intention. Cette preuve étant difficile à apporter, la Cour a jugé que l'intention génocidaire pouvait être déduite des actions constatées dès lors que ces actions établissaient l'existence d'une ligne de conduite, ce sont les mots qu'elle a employés, d'une ligne de conduite qui ne peut être raisonnablement comprise que comme traduisant une intention génocidaire. Mais comme on le sait, la Cour internationale de justice juge les États, elle ne juge pas les individus. Pour l'application de la Convention, elle a donc été amenée à se prononcer exclusivement sur le comportement des États. Conformément à la Convention, elle a recherché, dans chaque cas, si ceux-ci avaient rempli leurs obligations de prévention ou de poursuite des génocidaires. Mais elle a aussi été plus loin, puisqu'elle a interprété la Convention, et cela allait de soi dans un certain sens, comme interdisant aux États eux-mêmes de commettre un génocide, ce qui n'était pas prévu au texte. Ce faisant, elle a donc élaboré une jurisprudence sur la base du droit international général, précisant les conditions dans lesquelles la responsabilité des États pouvait être engagée en pareille circonstance. Je n'entrerai pas dans le détail de cette jurisprudence dans le temps limité dont je dispose. J'aimerais simplement vous en fournir un exemple concernant l'indemnisation des victimes de génocide. Celle-ci ne saurait évidemment obtenir directement de la Cour réparation du préjudice. Mais la Cour peut condamner l'État fautif à verser à l'État demandeur une indemnité que ce dernier devra rembourser aux victimes. Ainsi, en 2022, dans une affaire concernant la République démocratique du Congo et l'Ouganda, la Cour a condamné Kampala à verser au Congo une somme de 265 millions de dollars à reverser aux victimes, selon des modalités précisées au jugement. L'affaire ne concernait pas un cas de génocide, mais la solution retenue serait transposable sans difficulté dans un tel cas. Dernier point enfin, plus récemment, la Cour a à 2 reprises indiqué aux parties en urgence des mesures conservatoires. En 2020, elle a invité le Myanmar à prendre toutes les mesures en son pouvoir afin de prévenir la commission à l'encontre des Rohingyas de tout acte entrant dans les prévisions de la Convention. Puis en février dernier, l'Ukraine a exposé à la Cour que la Russie avait engagé contre elle une opération militaire qu'elle avait justifiée pour partie par le fait que l'Ukraine aurait commis un génocide dans le Donbass. L'Ukraine demandait à la Cour de juger que ces accusations étaient infondées et que par suite, l'opération militaire de la Russie était illicite. À ce stade de la procédure, bien entendu, la Cour n'a pas pris parti sur ces points, mais elle a le 16 mars enjoint à la Russie, et je cite, de suspendre immédiatement les opérations militaires commencées le 14 février sur le territoire ukrainien. Concluons. La Cour internationale de justice a interprété la Convention de 1948 de manière à la fois extensive et rigoureuse. Elle a fait de la prohibition du génocide une norme impérative du droit international de portée universelle. Elle a largement ouvert son prétoire pour assurer la répression du crime. Enfin, elle a jugé que les États pouvaient eux-mêmes être condamnés pour génocide par la Cour. Mais par ailleurs, elle a rappelé que le génocide était un crime d'une particulière gravité dont il convient de ne pas élargir la portée au mépris des textes. Enfin, elle est intervenue très rapidement pour prescrire aux États des mesures d'urgence obligatoires. Les solutions ainsi retenues souffrent bien entendu des faiblesses inhérentes au droit international dans une société composée d'États souverains. Un cadre juridique clair et contraignant, trop souvent ignoré d'ailleurs du grand public, n'en a pas moins été mis sur pied par la Cour, indépendamment des considérations de droit pénal dont vous aurez à connaître plus tard. Je suis heureux d'avoir pu tracer devant vous les contours de cette jurisprudence et vous remercie de votre attention.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président. Ce que je retiens personnellement de votre contribution extrêmement riche, c'est que la Cour internationale de justice a beau se prononcer sur la responsabilité des États, elle parvient tout de même à retrouver la finalité humaine de l'ordre juridique international qui était si cher à Georges Seel et finalement à répondre en partie aux préoccupations si justes qui ont été évoquées dans l'introduction par Madame Nadia Murad et qui sont aussi, je crois, les préoccupations du procureur Karim Khan, c'est-à-dire comment donner une place absolument centrale aux victimes dans le processus de justice pour crimes de génocide. Je cède sans plus tarder la parole à Madame la conseillère spéciale du secrétaire général des Nations Unies, Madame Wairimu Nderitu. Chère Madame, vous avez la parole.
Okay. Thank you very much, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, all of you who spare the time to be here today. I'm especially glad to not only be here, but also to see my friends. Sergey is here. Karim, I see Karim is there. So, I came from here. I was in the Central African Republic. And I must say, because this is the first stop where I've come from, the Central African Republic, that I arrived in the Central African Republic, had several meetings, closed-door meetings without media. But then the following day, when I went to the field, I went to a place called Bria. And when we got there, it's 1.5 hour flight from Bangui, the capital. And there was a huge demonstration against me, huge. And I couldn't believe it. I seeing my name on banners saying, you know, that you've come here to invent genocide. And I know, of course, just speaking to what people think about when they hear genocide, that just my mere presence, I hadn't even said anything. I didn't issue a press statement, and there were demonstrations. So I called the SRSG in Bangui, and I told her, you know, I can hardly get off the plane because there are demonstrations here. She said, it's the same thing here. I can't get out of the office. There are demonstrations here. And they're saying that you can come here to invent genocide. I hadn't said a thing. So, of course, I'm going to say a thing. And but it speaks to so much when people begin to look at genocide as this crime that you can hold demonstrations for when nobody has accused you of genocide in the first place. And tomorrow I'm headed to Iraq, and I will be there for 1.5 weeks. And I had hoped to go before I came to this meeting, but I'm glad that what's coming out of this meeting will be very useful in informing what I go there to do. So my immediate priorities in Iraq are, of course, accountability and prevention, because that's really the core of what I do. And accountability being so key, we've been following closely the fact of so few people, if any, having been brought to justice for what happened and continues to happen to the Yazidi. And prevention in terms of things not getting worse than they already are. So if I may briefly speak about my mandate, my mandate has 4 key elements. The first one is analysis. I collect information that I analyze. Much of the information comes from within the UN system. It's usually not written in such a way that it speaks to my mandate, so that's where the analysis comes in. And on the basis of that analysis, sometimes I go out on fact-finding missions, like I'm going to and I've come from, just to ascertain the information that we have. And on that basis, then I issue sometimes early warnings, sometimes I issue statements and say, this is what I'm seeing. And sometimes I write opinion pieces, but all the time I'm sending advice to the Secretary General and to the Security Council. And if need be, I speak to the Security Council directly. And like last year in October, I briefed the Security Council on hate speech and social media, and I invited the social media companies to brief with me. So we were there with Facebook and YouTube and TikTok and like virtually all of them. So the other thing that I do beyond the issuing of statements and advising is work to get the UN to collectively work towards prevention of genocide. So the methodological tool that we use, we call it the framework of analysis for the prevention of atrocity crimes, which has a list of risk factors that exist in a society that could be prone to genocide. And that particular tool, every special advisor who's been to this office has tweaked it, and I too, of course, am tweaking it to ensure that it carries, because these crimes, the risk factors keep changing. They are not constant. They keep responding to issues that we are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So, for example, like cybercrime, climate change, social media, we would not be in the framework of analysis. And so we are improving that to make sure that it gets in. So extremely important to, when thinking about the mandate that I have as special advisor on the prevention of genocide, to look at it from the perspective of what it says, but also what it does not say. So in relation to the topic today, it does not relate directly to reparations. My mandate does not relate directly to reparations. And it also doesn't equip me with the prerogative of determining whether genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity have been committed. Now, the framework of analysis that I just referenced doesn't speak only to the prevention of genocide. It also speaks to war crimes. So we analyze for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide itself, because of the wider mandate that I have of being in charge as well of responsibility to protect. Although we have an ASG who is in charge, Assistant Secretary General, who is in charge of responsibility to protect. Overall, my office is in charge of genocide and prevention of genocide and the responsibility to protect. So we rely, of course, on courts to make that determination of whether a genocide has happened or not. And very grateful to the work that is done by Serge, by Karim, in making sure that those determinations are made. And in terms of prosecution. So accountability is central to my mandate and for atrocity crimes, because without accountability, we know that perpetrators continue committing those crimes. Before I came to the UN to this position, I used to mediate armed conflict. And I spent a lot of time with armed groups, with Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, all those in the Philippines as well. Did a lot of work in Mindanao and in Myanmar. Actually, in 2015, I was there. And I have seen what the lack of accountability does, how powerful it makes those who commit perpetrators, and how impunity thrives on the lack of accountability. So victims also, I saw often in Nigeria, the reprisal attacks, for example, in Cameroon, back and forth, because then the accountability is missing. And so without this criminal accountability or any judicial venue to address allegations, then the back and forth just keeps going back and forth. Then, of course, we know about the peace versus justice debate. It accompanies our work all the time. I have worked both in human rights and in peace building, and this followed me everywhere that I went. And I know that the methods of making peace sometimes are counter to justice, that sometimes you have to sit at the table with the people who are the worst perpetrators, because those who perpetrate crimes are also the same people who have the power to stop those crimes from happening. So you sit with them at the table to broker peace, but at the same time, accountability must constitute this key component of peace. And in regard to traditional systems, when we look at the systems that used to be there, that accountability was always key. It was always core. So I have seen, I must point out, in terms of one of the key challenges since I came into this office that I've seen is the huge amount of Holocaust and genocide denial of crimes adjudicated by competent courts, and conclusively so. And it's incredible to watch how that has unfolded. When we talk about anti-Semitism, when we talk about this genocide denial, Srebrenica, Rwanda as well, the genocide against the Tutsi, we see it's framed in all kinds of languages. And what I must point out is how I've seen the connection between the two, how the templates borrow from each other, the templates of Holocaust denial and genocide denial, I have seen all these conferences, for example, that have been held in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where they deny that the genocide in Srebrenica happened, and they deny using the same template of the Holocaust deniers. They look at the numbers, they say, you know, this number of people are not killed. They say, give us the signature, where was it signed that these people should be killed, you know, all those kind of things, same arguments. But very disturbingly, they hold academic conferences, these Holocaust deniers and genocide deniers, and one of the purposes of these academic conferences is to produce papers in which they cite each other. So in essence, they are building a body of knowledge on denial, so that when you Google around Srebrenica genocide, then the kind of body of knowledge that comes to you, the citations that come to you are from them. So they are very coordinated. They are doing things in a very coordinated way. The other thing I would like to say is that about hate speech. Hate speech is domiciled in my office in the UN. In 2019, the Secretary General launched a plan of action, a strategy and plan of action for hate speech. And it is domiciled in my office as the focal point. And why this is so is because we keep making a very clear connection to everybody in the UN and, of course, everyone else that we work with, that hate speech is not disconnected from genocide. The Tutsi needed to be described as cockroaches for the genocide to happen. They needed to be dehumanized that way. The Jews needed to be described as cancers for the Holocaust to happen. In the Rohingya in Myanmar, we saw the descriptions of the Rohingya as fleas and as thorns that pierced skins that needed to be removed. So it's the essence of hate speech as not just a precursor, but as an accompaniment, and in the shape of genocide and Holocaust denial, as something that comes up often, is something that we cannot ignore. So in terms of accountability, prevention, reparations, I must say something about transitional justice, because transitional justice is important, provides a venue for expression of people's grief, but also provides space for processes such as security sector reform and disarmament and mobilization and rehabilitation, all those things that need to happen. And so what I have seen in terms of my work as a mediator is how often transitional justice is absent from peace processes. I look at peace agreements and do not see in many parts transitional justice measures put out in ways that can be implemented after the peace agreement. And of course, inclusion, extremely important, and decisions brought to the community level. And I must say in conclusion that I always advocate for us listening more to communities, but also advocate for the fact of the truth of what happened during the Holocaust, during the genocide, Srebrenica, Rwanda, and I'm talking about, of course, what we legally recognize as genocide, that all that truth is in all these judicial decisions, and that it's not unpacked, and that it's not easy for, say, anyone, the common person in the streets, to make an argument for the Holocaust really happened unless we unpack all these decisions. These decisions are in legal language. Unless you're an academic or you're a lawyer, then it's difficult for you to be looking into those kind of decisions to unpack them. We must unpack them. We must get them out of that space, make them into something that everybody can just discuss and speak about. And finally, we need to ratify the Convention of Genocide, the 1948 Convention. So far, we have 153 ratifications, the latest one being just a month ago from Zambia. So we need to ratify it. If we don't ratify these conventions, the Rome Statute, the 1948 Convention, then justice then becomes so far from the people that really it's intended to serve. So thank you very much. I'd like to stop there.
Je vous remercie beaucoup, chère madame, de nous avoir fait part de votre expérience personnelle de terrain et d'avoir rappelé qu'effectivement, le travail de prévention du bureau commence dès les prémices, dès les premiers signes d'une dérive, y compris une dérive de langage avec les discours de haine. Voilà, il ne faut rien laisser passer. Merci beaucoup. Je cède immédiatement la parole au procureur Bramers pour la dernière intervention sur la détermination des responsabilités, mais cette fois-ci au plan de la responsabilité pénale individuelle. Monsieur le procureur, vous avez la parole.
Merci beaucoup. Merci de m'avoir invité, monsieur l'ambassadeur. Chers amis, merci d'être présents si nombreux et de montrer l'intérêt pour ce sujet particulièrement important. La justice internationale est sous pression, comme l'est le multilatéralisme. Nous avons déjà parlé de toute une série de conflits et malheureusement, si on regarde les conflits partout dans le monde, l'impunité est la règle et les poursuites l'exception. Donc je suis très heureux de voir aujourd'hui beaucoup d'acteurs, Nadia, Karim, Alice et beaucoup d'autres qui luttent pour changer cette réalité et pour veiller à ce qu'il y ait plus de poursuites dans ces domaines. Évidemment, aujourd'hui, la question est un peu de savoir qu'est-ce que nous avons réussi, quels sont les défis pour demain. Et je pourrais parler, évidemment, pendant des heures des juridictions ad hoc. Et quand les juridictions ad hoc étaient créées en 93-94, manifestement, c'était plus facile au Conseil de sécurité de se mettre d'accord sur les grands enjeux. C'était après la guerre froide où je pensais que le concept nouveau de justice internationale était né d'une certaine manière, qui a vu évidemment plus tard la création de la Cour pénale internationale. Les juridictions ad hoc qui ont certainement joué un rôle très important, tribunal pour le Rwanda, plus de 50 condamnations pour génocide, y compris le chef de gouvernement de l'époque. Tribunal pour l'ex-Yougoslavie, 8 condamnations pour génocide par rapport à Srebrenica. Jurisprudence très importante sur les éléments constitutifs du crime de génocide. Je ne vais pas rentrer dans les détails. Et ce n'est que l'année dernière que la dernière condamnation pour l'ex-Yougoslavie, c'était le général Mladic, condamné à vie en appel en 21, énormément d'années après le conflit. Et nous connaissons tous, certainement les étudiants parmi vous, justice delayed is justice denied. Eh bien, il faut accepter qu'au niveau de la justice internationale, c'est différent. Quelqu'un qui est au pouvoir aujourd'hui, eh bien, par moment, il faut avoir la patience nécessaire et d'attendre le temps qu'il faut pour que la personne puisse être poursuivie. Nous avons heureusement vu ces dernières années que les États-nations, que les juridictions nationales, que ce soit en France, en Belgique et dans beaucoup d'autres pays, la justice nationale poursuit les auteurs de crimes internationaux, aussi pour crimes de génocide. Et je crois que c'est très important. Et je crois que nous sommes tous d'accord qu'aujourd'hui, il faut partager les responsabilités entre les institutions internationales, la justice internationale et les juridictions nationales. Mais je ne vais pas parler de jurisprudence, vous la connaissez certainement. Je vais peut-être dire 2-3 mots sur les défis. Défis qu'avaient les différents procureurs des juridictions ad hoc, qui sont les mêmes défis que Karim rencontre aujourd'hui, liés évidemment à la coopération, car toutes les enquêtes ont lieu à l'étranger par définition. J'ai mentionné, et ça a été mentionné, le génocide de Srebrenica, qui a eu lieu une année après la création du tribunal pour l'ex-Yougoslavie, juste pour dire que la prévention d'une nouvelle justice internationale ne marche pas nécessairement dans les zones de conflit. Mais malgré l'existence du tribunal à ce niveau-là, malgré l'accord de paix de Dayton, ça a pris plus d'1 an pour le premier enquêteur international d'être sur place. Et entre-temps, les Serbes de Bosnie avaient bougé des milliers de corps de fosses communes principales vers des fosses communes secondaires. Et encore aujourd'hui, chaque année, des tombes sont retrouvées. Et le 11 juillet de chaque année, les corps des victimes sont remis aux familles en Bosnie. Coopération qui reste toujours très difficile. Nous l'avons vu en ce qui nous concerne avec Karadzic et Mladic, crimes commis au début des années 90, arrêtés en 98 et en 2011, autant d'années après le conflit. Et une fois de plus, les premières années, quand il y avait les mandats d'arrêt internationaux, ils se promenaient librement en Serbie, en Bosnie, les forces de maintien de la paix regardaient de l'autre côté, parce qu'évidemment, à un moment donné, il y a une sorte de conflit entre les forces de maintien de la paix et la poursuite internationale, où les forces de maintien de la paix savent parfaitement bien, s'ils essaient d'arrêter quelqu'un qui est considéré comme un héros national, que cela peut avoir un effet déstabilisateur. Et nous parlons aujourd'hui aussi de l'importance de l'Union européenne, et j'ai eu le privilège d'être le procureur pour l'ex-Yougoslavie, tribunal pour l'ex-Yougoslavie depuis 2008, et si nous avons eu en 2008 et en 2011 la chance d'arrêter les derniers fugitifs et d'être le seul tribunal international sans fugitifs en fuite, c'est certainement grâce aussi à l'Union européenne, à la politique de conditionnalité où Bruxelles a dit clairement aux pays de l'ex-Yougoslavie, vous souhaitez rejoindre l'Union européenne, eh bien, il y a toute une série de critères à remplir, politiques, mais aussi judiciaires, voire rule of law. Et si vous souhaitez avoir le statut de pays candidat, eh bien, il faut arrêter les fugitifs. Et je souhaiterais dire ici qu'un procureur international n'est qu'aussi fort que l'appui politique dont il bénéficie. Ça a été très important tout au long de ma carrière, et c'est excessivement important pour le procureur de la CPI. Et un petit mot à ce niveau-là, vous avez peut-être vu que hier, nous avons annoncé qu'un des fugitifs du tribunal pour le Rwanda est décédé. Vous savez probablement qu'il y a 2 ans, on a réussi à arrêter Félicien Kabuga, qui est considéré comme un des plus importants génocidaires au Rwanda, arrêté seulement il y a 2 ans. Autre dossier clôturé seulement hier, Mpiranya, qui était le commandant de la garde présidentielle au début du génocide. Et je souhaite dire aussi que j'ai vu toute une série de collègues néerlandais qu'on était très, très heureux d'avoir l'appui du Dutch Forensic Institute, Nederlands Forensic Institute, qui nous aide à chaque fois à faire toutes les analyses ADN. Et je souhaite vraiment aussi remercier nos partenaires hollandais dans ce contexte. Mais ce qui reste et est frustrant, c'est que cette coopération, encore aujourd'hui, n'est pas automatique. On pourrait croire que pour un procureur qui est mandaté par le Conseil de sécurité à poursuivre des fugitifs soupçonnés d'avoir commis des crimes dans un pays membre, la coopération va de soi. Malheureusement, ça n'a pas du tout été la situation. Pendant ces dernières années, il y a eu une difficulté à obtenir la coopération du Zimbabwe, où on a trouvé le corps d'un de nos fugitifs, mais aussi depuis 3 ans, des problèmes avec l'Afrique du Sud. Et c'était assez particulier, pour ne pas dire frustrant, pour un procureur de faire rapport au Conseil de sécurité et d'être obligé de mentionner un membre du Conseil de sécurité, membre non permanent, présent dans la salle, pour non-coopération avec un procureur international. Nous avions localisé un de nos fugitifs, Kayeshima, en Afrique du Sud, il y a 3 ans. Il est soupçonné d'avoir été présent quand des grenades étaient lancées dans une église, tuant des centaines de femmes et d'enfants. Et ça a été très frustrant de voir que, malgré être confronté à un dossier aussi clair, avoir localisé un fugitif dans un État, membre des Nations Unies, mais aussi membre du Conseil de sécurité, ça a toujours été, et ça reste toujours aussi difficile aujourd'hui, d'avoir cette coopération. Alors, si c'est difficile pour un procureur des Nations Unies, on peut facilement s'imaginer les défis pour le procureur de la CPI. Dernier 2 petits mots, le temps passe vite, complémentarité. Nous aimons dire que les juridictions ad hoc, on a eu plus de 160 dossiers tribunal pour l'ex-Yougoslavie, plus de 90 dossiers pour le Rwanda, les 2 tribunaux ensemble, plus de dossiers que toutes les autres juridictions ensemble, mais fait est que ce n'est qu'une petite partie des crimes commis. J'étais à Sarajevo la semaine dernière, eh bien il y a encore 3000 dossiers toujours en instruction. Des centaines de dossiers qui doivent être poursuivis au Rwanda. Mon collègue, le procureur général du Rwanda, a toujours plus de 1200 mandats d'arrêt en suspens. Donc tout ça pour dire que même si vous avez une juridiction ad hoc qui ne traite qu'une seule situation pendant 25 ans, C'est impossible d'avoir une approche globale et complète des crimes poursuivis. C'est pour ça que je plaide toujours pour une complémentarité positive à beaucoup de niveaux, évidemment la justice internationale, mais aussi la justice régionale là où c'est possible, définitivement les pays où les crimes ont été commis, et si possible les pays tiers qui ont une compétence universelle. Et dernier mot, Alice vient de le mentionner, s'il y a quelque chose qui, je trouve aujourd'hui le plus décevant, c'est certainement le déni de génocide, la glorification des criminels de guerre. Quand on part en Bosnie, en République Srpska ou en Serbie, voir des posters de criminels de guerre condamnés est excessivement désagréable. Avoir des ministres de l'enseignement qui enlèvent des cours d'école toute référence au génocide de Srebrenica ou au siège de Sarajevo en disant que ces événements n'ont jamais eu lieu, c'est excessivement décevant. Et je pense que ça, c'est un rôle des hommes politiques, des professeurs d'université, d'être plus prononcés en condamnant ce genre de comportement et en le considérant pas du tout acceptable. Merci beaucoup.
Je vous remercie beaucoup, Monsieur le procureur. On pourrait évidemment parler des heures du sujet de la coopération. Juste peut-être deux choses que j'ai retenues de vos propos. La première, c'est que, comme le disait Antonio Cassese, la juridiction pénale internationale est un géant sans bras ni jambes si elle n'a pas la coopération des États et des organisations internationales ou régionales pour l'appuyer. La deuxième chose, peut-être, puisque nous sommes dans le cadre de la présidence française, je me disais que peut-être qu'un jour, on pourra dire, comme on enseigne le droit de l'Union européenne, peut-être qu'un jour, on pourra dire que le juge national est le juge de droit commun du droit international pénal, comme il est celui du droit de l'Union européenne, comme il faut qu'il le soit, en tout cas, et que donc les juridictions pénales internationales ne seraient plus que des aiguillons pour inciter évidemment les États à mettre en œuvre cette complémentarité positive que vous appelez de vos vœux. Nous avons le temps de prendre seulement deux questions. Je m'en excuse par avance auprès, bien sûr, de l'ensemble des participants. Deux véritables questions, c'est-à-dire pas des commentaires de 5 minutes sur les propos passionnants que vous avez entendus, parce que malheureusement, vous l'aurez compris, nous devons terminer à l'heure. Je vois, cher monsieur, oui, peut-être micro.
A very good afternoon to everybody. I'm Khaled Ahmed Chaudhry. I have been listening about genocide in Bosnia, about ISIS crimes in Iraq, and some other areas in Europe. We could not hear anything, the genocide in Myanmar, the genocide committed at different occasions, times in Afghanistan, and we could not hear anything about hundreds of thousands casualties of civilians in Iraq during WMD war. My question to former president of the ICJ, sir, would you like to join me to demand at this stage of your age to arrest George Bush, Dick Cheney, and then Tony Blair and their other cabinet members for the war crimes they have committed in different regions of the world? Because if we cannot demand for the arrest of these war criminals, then we should simply speak about selective justice. We should not use international justice. Thank you, sir.
Alors, je ne sais pas s'il faut... je prends les questions, on prend toutes les questions, d'accord. Ok, on va faire comme ça. Alors, donc, une première question... Pour vous ou pour vous, monsieur le procureur aussi, hein, finalement, parce que c'est plus quand même du pénal international. Deuxième question. Alors, bon, allez, micro, par ici.
Merci, madame le modérateur. Bonjour tout le monde et merci aux organisateurs pour cette conférence qui a un sujet tristement d'actualité. Une question rapide pour Monsieur le Président. Guillaume. Vous avez parlé tout à l'heure d'une décision de mars enjoignant à la Russie d'arrêter immédiatement ses hostilités. Quelle est l'efficacité des Nations Unies, puisque la CIJ est l'organe le plus ancien des Nations Unies? Quelle est l'efficacité des Nations Unies quand on démontre au monde entier qu'une décision de mars n'est pas susceptible de faire arrêter les hostilités, et mieux, ou plus, qu'en présence du secrétaire général des Nations Unies à Kiev, il y a eu un bombardement en sa présence et à côté de lui. Ne pensez-vous pas qu'il est temps de comprendre que 1945 est très loin de nous et que le terme des 5 grands n'a plus de signification quand un des grands peut être à la limite d'appuyer sur le bouton nucléaire, il est encore membre permanent du Conseil de sécurité. Ne pensez-vous pas qu'il est temps de modifier tout cela? J'ai juste oublié de me présenter. Xavier Jean Keita, je suis conseil principal de la défense à la Cour pénale internationale. Je vous remercie, Madame la modératrice.
Merci, maître. La dernière question était devant. Désolée de ne pas pouvoir prendre plus de questions, mais voilà.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor. Paulina Dudzik, legal advisor, Polish Embassy here in The Hague. I just have one quick question. Well, Professor Rafał Lemkin, who was Polish Jewish lawyer, after the war, right after the war, he actually became, we would say, one-man lobby to basically force it to adopt a convention barring genocide. And of course, we honor his legacy and his incredible contribution to the international law. And while the law itself is clear what constitutes a genocide, some experts nowadays argue that the legal standard for genocide itself is so specific that it is rarely applicable to mass killings and other brutal acts perpetrated against a group. And these legal experts also argue that the definition of genocide is currently not sufficient to simply prevent people from perpetrating this crime, and that since it is so hard to prove it, prosecutors bring genocide cases too seldom. Of course, we have some very positive and recent examples like Prosecutor Brammertz mentioned, but I would be honored to hear your views on this topic. Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, si je résume, nous avons donc 3 questions. Une question sur la sélectivité de la justice internationale, une question sur la nécessité de renouveler le système de 1945 et une question sur finalement la difficile application de la définition relative au génocide. Je vous laisse peut-être répondre pour 1945, Monsieur le Président.
Écoutez, ça marche?
Oui, ça fonctionne.
Bon, écoutez, moi je suis prêt à vous parler des faiblesses et des forces de la Cour internationale de justice. Je ne suis pas prêt à vous parler des faiblesses et des forces des Nations Unies en tant que telles. Ça n'a pas été mon métier, ce n'est pas mon rôle. Ce que je peux dire, c'est que les décisions de la Cour internationale de justice sont obligatoires pour les parties et que les mesures conservatoires sont également obligatoires d'après la jurisprudence de la Cour. Bien. Là-dessus, la Cour n'a pas de gendarmes ou de policiers ou de forces armées pour faire exécuter ses décisions. La charte prévoit que le Conseil de sécurité peut jouer un certain rôle à cet égard. Il a été saisi une fois, il a été bloqué par un veto, donc cette voie n'est pour l'instant pas très prometteuse. Nous vivons dans une société d'États souverains, il faut se le dire. Il faut se dire que nous vivons dans un monde westphalien depuis 1648. et que, par voie de conséquence, la justice internationale, mon Dieu, elle a un très grand rôle qui est de rappeler le droit. Et ce n'est pas inutile qu'on sache quel est le droit et quelles sont les erreurs et les fautes commises. Mais que malheureusement, l'exécution de ces décisions dépend des États eux-mêmes. Alors, j'ajouterais que, en dehors des cas qui ont été évoqués, dans l'immense majorité des cas, heureusement, les décisions de la Cour sont exécutées. Parfois avec un peu de retard, comme il se doit, mais elles sont exécutées. Je vous remercie.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Sur la définition du génocide et les difficultés d'application.
Yeah, well, I can say two words in relation to your quite complex question. We all know that international justice is not universal and that mandates are limited by international players. You have seen over the last years difficult discussions within the Security Council where, like France, making proposals to have referrals in relation to Syria to the Security Council, but where there is no consensus. And all international tribunals have de facto limited mandates in relation to jurisdictions. And as long as international justice is not universal, this problem will be there. And it is also obvious if you look at the International Criminal Court, and the prosecutor will speak about it. I worked there as deputy prosecutor in the early days, and it's just impossible with the resources which are available there to conduct investigations everywhere in the world. So even for an international court, you have to determine priorities. And this is definitely, I would say, the most difficult part of the job of every international prosecutors, because you have to be selective in relation to the individual incidents you are prosecuting and not prosecuting. So you have to select between grave crimes and even worse crimes. And this is really always very, very difficult to make this selection, knowing that many crimes will go unpunished, even if you have jurisdiction. Thank you.
Okay, maybe just to say that, of course, the debate about, since the Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine began, there have been all these debates about the Security Council. And just to say that even in its present state, the way it is structured right now, that we do have other bodies that have become very robust. So the General Assembly right now is very robust. The Human Rights Council is very, very robust. It doesn't take away from the fact of the question that you've asked about the Security Council, but I do think that the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council have stepped in a way that we didn't expect them to. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à vous tous. Nous allons laisser la place au deuxième panel.
So thank you very much. Distinguished panelists of panel one, thanks for a great substantive introduction and also transition to our next panel. We are waiting the Prime Minister. We are a little bit over time, so we would request you to take a short break, just a 2-minute break, that we get the new panel installed so that we make on time. Thank you. Our second panel, may I ask you to take a seat, please? Our second panel today discusses the various ways in which international, regional, and domestic jurisdictions contribute to accountability practices and also innovate investigations. The idea is to look back as how the architecture of international justice evolved, but also to look at the future roles, to look at the role of the ICC, but also hybrid jurisdictions and domestic jurisdictions. Contexts like Syria or Ukraine or Iraq show us that certainly no entity alone can investigate and prosecute such crimes. We need a multi-dimensional justice response. And the Frankfurt genocide trial in November last year has been a landmark trial, since it was one of the first instances in which genocide was acknowledged through a single case rather than a series of judgments, as was the case in the context of the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. It's also shown that sexual and gender-based violence cannot only be investigated and prosecuted internationally, but also domestically. We also want to look forward and to inquire, where should we go from here? What does this new diversity mean for this idea of a system of justice? How can we strengthen collaboration and regional mechanisms? What are the new challenges that arise in terms of coordination and cooperation? We need to avoid a duplication of efforts, a chasing for the same evidence, and to improve also the use of digital open source material in criminal proceedings. The situation in Ukraine shows us that no crimes are invisible. It has just triggered the first domestic cases within weeks of the crimes being committed, or at least allegations being launched. But it also offers new prospects of cooperation between international courts and domestic justice. We've seen this with the joint investigative teams being established, and also the new proposals for the reform of Eurojust. So the idea of complementarity and regionalization is gaining a new momentum. We have a wonderful set of speakers to address these set of questions. ICC prosecutor Karim Khan has had a distinguished career in domestic practice and international criminal litigation, both for the defense and victims. And before his election as prosecutor, he obviously also served as special advisor and head of the United Nations investigative team to promote accountability for crimes committed by Daesh ISIL in Iraq. So he has a special link to the theme of today, and obviously also the cause of Nadia Murad's initiative. We have President Ekaterina Trendafilova, who is the president of the Kosovo Specialist Chambers, former judge of the ICC, and she also has extensive experience in relation to domestic criminal reform. She also served as a professor in criminal justice at the Faculty of Law in Sofia. And then we have Dr. Anna Zabek, who is a senior prosecutor at the Office of the Federal Public Prosecutor in Germany. She was involved in some of the ISIS cases brought under German jurisdiction, and she will bring, I think, invaluable insights from really the front line of where domestic jurisdiction stands today. So we will start with the three presentations. We suggest that we give the floor to ladies first. So President Trendafilova, who will set developments into perspectives, also in relation to the development of genocide in the context also of hybrid jurisdictions, would start. Then we move on to Prosecutor Khan, and then to Anna Zabek. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Excellencies, colleagues, friends. I'm grateful to be here today, and I would like to start with my thankfulness to His Excellency Ambassador Louis Vassy for organizing this very important event together with his devoted staff, and for having invited me to make my humble contribution to this important event. I would also like to express my deep admiration, Ms. Murad. Your invaluable contribution based on your unspeakable experience, Ms. Murad, to end sexual violence being a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions and the common weapon used in wars, sends hope to so many victims and survivors of such atrocities. Of course, it is a pleasure to be sitting on the same panel with Mr. Karim Khan, the ICC prosecutor, who is facing a very difficult task in these very difficult times, and let us hope that he will be successful in fulfilling his mission. And of course, Dr. Zabek, who has been so important in some of the seminal cases recently in Germany that became so popular, a famous experienced senior federal prosecutor. And lastly, of course, I'm very pleased to have as the moderator this panel, Professor Dr. Carsten Stan, who is a respected academic in international criminal law, but also a dear colleague and a friend. Even I'm his second mom, because we used to work together at the International Criminal Court. So today's conference is truly timely, and it is especially important now to emphasize the significant role of international, hybrid, regional, and domestic courts and tribunals in ending impunity for the most serious international crimes, and also to demonstrate the international community's unequivocal support for these courts and tribunals. This is also an opportunity to provide ideas from the rich experience of international courts and tribunals to the changing architecture of international criminal justice, as is one of the questions that in his comments to the panelists Karsten posed some days ago. I very well understand his question because we are witnessing the developments of the conflict in Ukraine and its terrible consequences. The international community has joined in its genuine willingness to help terminate the conflict and also to hold to account those who are responsible for the horrific crimes committed. This necessitates initiatives to be undertaken and begs the legitimate question: should the architecture of international criminal justice change? And if the answer is in the positive, how this will happen? The history of international criminal justice provides plenty of examples of changes in the architecture of international criminal justice. Changes are the natural development prompted by the need to find solutions to different situations and different atrocities that occur over several decades. Thus, atrocities committed during the First and the Second World Wars have been addressed differently in accordance to the specific circumstances and, in particular, the different political climate at the time of the two wars. Investigating the crimes of the First World War was left to domestic jurisdictions, while the modality of the architecture for those crimes committed in the course of the Second World War was different. The major criminals and new category of international crimes, such as the crime against peace and genocide, fell under the mandate of the newly established international military tribunals in 1945 and 46. The architecture of international criminal justice was further altered with the emergence of new conflicts and the change in the geopolitical landscape. A seminal example is the 1948 Genocide Convention, a convention which is one of the most important, significant legal instruments in modern times. And as was already said, it not only codified and defined the crime of genocide, but also regulated in detail the modalities of its adjudication through domestic courts and a potential future international criminal tribunal. Thus, this convention paved the way for the creation of future international judicial mechanisms over the crime of genocide, but also over the crimes against humanity, war crimes, the crime of aggression, and other grave crimes. Another important change in the architecture of international criminal justice is undoubtedly the creation of the International Criminal Court. Although the drafters of the Rome Statute initially considered that a permanent court would substitute the ad hoc tribunals, this notion has proven to be unrealistic for a number of reasons, to mention some. First, the ICC has jurisdiction only over a limited category of international crimes, as we know, and therefore it cannot deal with other grave crimes, such as, for example, the crime of terrorism. Therefore, this crime, the acts of terrorism, were dealt with by the special ad hoc special tribunal for Lebanon, dealing with the terrorist attack against the former president of Lebanon, Hariri. Second, the temporal jurisdiction of the ICC is confined to crimes committed after the Rome Statute entered into force, the 1st of July 2002. Thus, it is for the ad hoc tribunals, regional and domestic courts to fill in the gap for crimes committed prior to this date. Further, not all UN member states are state parties to the Rome Statute. in order to narrow down the impunity gap, the existence of other tribunals alongside with the ICC appears indispensable. Importantly, the ICC has limited capacity and resources to investigate and prosecute all the situations that it has been confronted with. It has only 18 judges and only one office of the prosecutor. With these considerations in mind, and with the increase of conflicts with different nature, new courts and tribunals emerged, which is another change in the architecture of international criminal justice. I should spare the examples. We know the ICTY, ICTR, the East Timor, the Regulation 64 panels, the Central African Republic, and so on. Most of these courts have the crime of genocide in their material jurisdiction. There are some other tribunals like the Special Court for Sierra Leone and the Kosovo Specialist Chambers that do not have under their material jurisdiction the crime of genocide, but other grave crimes, war crimes and crimes against humanity. Also, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, as I mentioned already, was competent to deal with acts of terrorism. Despite the difference in their mandates, temporal scope, subject matter jurisdiction, and the different methods of their creation, those courts and tribunals were changing the architecture of international criminal justice, not only by their existence, but more importantly, through the significant contribution they made in the fight against impunity through their operation. I should mention the Rwanda Tribunal in modern times was the first tribunal to charge and convict individuals for genocide. In the landmark judgment in the case against Jean-Paul Akiesu, the trial chamber for the first time interpreted the definition of genocide as set forth in the Genocide Convention and entered a conviction. The trial chamber also recognized that rape, something that was raised by the special advisor. I'm sorry, I cannot provide your name because I didn't have the pleasure to work with you. So the crime of rape could also be used as means of perpetrating genocide. In the so-called also media case, as you also mentioned, Madame, against Ferdinand Nahimana et al., the ICTR further clarified the scope of genocide when it found that members of the media can be held responsible for inciting others to commit genocide through their broadcasts. The ad hoc international tribunals also clarified the scope of the four categories of protected by the convention groups: national, ethnic, racial, and religious. And in the course of their developing jurisprudence, they shifted from the objective criteria to define what constitutes a national group to a more subjective one, whereby in the case, Ilishik case recognized the trial chamber, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, that the criterion should be the perception of the perpetrator to define national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. International courts and tribunals also held accountable heads of states and other key members of governments for the core crimes under their jurisdiction. And here I shall mention the former Rwanda Prime Minister, Jean Kambanda, about the genocide against the Tutsis. The ICTY indicted back then the sitting head of state, Slobodan Milosevic, for the crimes against Bosnian Muslims. The ICC issued a warrant of arrest back then, and I was also dealing with this crime and with this case, against the sitting head of state, Omar al-Bashir, for the crime of genocide committed in Darfur, Sudan. We have also, for the crimes against humanity and war crimes, the conviction of the head of state of Liberia, Charles Taylor. Also, at the ICC, the former president, head of state of Ivory Coast, Mr. Gbagbo, has been indicted. And recently, The sitting head of state of Kosovo has been indicted by the specialist prosecutor of the Specialist Prosecutor's Office in our institution. Further, international courts and tribunals also indicted and convicted women for the crime of genocide and other grave crimes. And here, for the crime of genocide, I will mention the ICTR case against Ms. Pauline Nyuramasuhuko, who was back then the Rwanda Minister of Family Welfare and Advancement of Women during the 1994 genocide. Of course, I have also to mention the extraordinary chambers for the courts in the courts of Cambodia, the charge against Ms. Yang Pirith, again with genocide, who was back then the Khmer Rouge Minister of Social Affairs. However, she was found unfit to stand trial, and that's why the proceedings were terminated against her. And a last mention is Ms. Simone Gbagbo, again for crimes against humanity, and she was having the position of President of the parliamentary group of the Ivorian Popular Front. However, the arrest warrant was vacated because the Office of the Prosecutor found insufficient crimes for the state very important element provided in Article 7, paragraph 2 of the Rome Statute, the element of organizational policy. These courts and tribunals and their jurisprudence played an important role in interpreting and defining the elements of international crimes, which served very well for like a guidance for the domestic jurisdictions when they were dealing with domestic crimes. And here, of course, we know that some states are extremely active pursuant to universal jurisdiction, and this is France, Germany, Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands, and of course I'm not exhaustive. These developments in the architecture of international criminal justice could also be very useful guide on how to address core crimes such as genocide and also the current crimes that the Office of the Prosecutor, not only domestic institutions, are dealing with, and this is the very, very problematic situation, the conflict in Ukraine. Of course, this could also help in cases where the ICC cannot perform its mandate, for example, for the crimes committed in Syria. So there could be some kind of guidance how the grave crimes committed in Syria could also be addressed by the international community. So here, the question that was posed by Karsten, the purpose of my short survey was just to give evidence that the changing landscape, the changing reality immediately reflects, and that is how it should be, given the role of law to regulate and to find as soon as possible mechanisms to react to problems identified by the international community and, of course, by ordinary people. With regard to the situation in Ukraine, we are witnessing, as Karsten said, very important initiatives, these joint investigative teams, this collected referral that was made to your office, Mr. Khan. I think that 43 states have already, the readiness of states to provide their representatives pro bono to support you in your investigations and hopefully successful building of the cases. And here, of course, I'm very much tempted just to share that it will be very important to consider a number of problematic areas like how you're going for those actors who would like to support your office and what you're going to do, how you're going to be in a successful cooperation with them, how you're going to be able to provide one methodology so that you are not going to receive the results of investigations from different initiatives which, for example, are not going to abide by the standards that you need according to the Rome Statute to prove the crimes that you're investigating. Also, what evidence could be used, and here, of course, some very important safeguards have to be taken into consideration. How, at this stage of the proceedings, what are your expectations? Because all those who are helping you have to be mindful of the fact that at this stage you have just to receive the green light from the pretrial chamber, and not to have a ready prepared case, because it's going to take a lot of time, not to overwhelm your office with enormous amount of evidence that is going to delay very much your ambitious investigations to reach the ultimate goal, to bring into account those who are responsible for the crimes that we are all very much concerned about. So that is what I wanted, but I will meet you and we can talk much more on this.
So thank you so much, President Trandafilova, for showing us also how the tribunals brought genocide, how the tribunals brought genocide out of the box, and how we've seen new tribunals engaging also with different categories of crimes that we don't see, for instance, in the jurisdiction of the ICC. Of course, we both bombarded our prosecutor already with questions, so it's really an honor and a true pleasure, Mr. Prosecutor, that you joined us to be here today. I know that positive complementarity is a topic which is also dear to your heart, how these different mechanisms can work together. Thanks so much for sharing your vision today.
Well, thank you so much, Carsten. It's really wonderful to be here. Thank you for the hosting this event, to Ambassador Louis Vassy for the Presidency of the Republic of France for holding what is really a critically important event. And it's an honor, of course, to share the platform with you, President Trandafilova, with Dr. Zbek as well, and to have really so many illustrious people in the room. Of course, President Guillaume, Sergey Brammertz, Alice Nderitu. And I see so many ambassadors and so many students, which are really the future. It's really you that have a very important part to play. We're, if not, we may be the present, but we're becoming the past. And the good news, probably that's the good news. The good news is you are all the future. But I must say something about Nadia, Murad, and Abid. We heard Nadia's opening address, and I've had the privilege of knowing Nadia and Abid. I've seen them publicly, I've seen them privately, and I'm very proud to say that Nadia I view very much as a sister or a daughter, given my age, and Abid as a brother, and I have great affection and respect for them. And every time I see them, it's inspiring. Every time I see them, I feel I want to do better. And every time I see them, I'm sorry to say, I feel ashamed. Because it's a walking, breathing testament of our collective failure. As was said earlier, the ICC is a child of Nuremberg. And the horrors of Nuremberg, hell on earth, something one couldn't conjure up in one's worst nightmares. In fact, the legacy of Nuremberg is the nightmare of the present. That singular moment gave rise to a hope and a prayer of never again. And I'm sorry that prayer, we run the danger of that prayer being a ritual incantation that is not given life to. Because, of course, as Prosecutor Sergey Brammertz knows, as so many know in the room, we saw Yugoslavia, we've seen Rwanda, we've seen Sierra Leone, we've seen, of course, Cambodia, we've seen Iraq, we see things going on in Myanmar, we see things going on in so many parts of the world, which is a running scar on our soul as humans. And that's simply the reality. And honestly, my view is when I hear, and of course we all wish to have time, I want time. I'm a new prosecutor, I see changes, I have issues of resources, I see issues of substance, of quality, of judgment, and all these demands which are righteous demands for justice. And of course, one understands when sometimes it's said, victims be patient. But the simple reality that we can't get away from is we cannot any longer put the burden on victims. They've already suffered. and we're telling victims, please be patient. The burden is upon ourselves to take action, to give life to something which is a human right, which is justice. What are we as a species? Where are we going? With all the science, with all the technology, with nanotechnology, with brilliant scientists that are helping us with COVID-19 and pandemics, how come it is within our grasp to make the world fairer? And Nadia hit upon Nadia Murad hit upon an important point. Justice has a very wide term. In the broad sense, education, access to education, women's rights, gender rights, economic possibilities, and then we have a part to play, which is international criminal justice. We need to manage expectations, because when we come in, very often, injustice has already been etched very indelibly on the soul, because people have been killed and loved ones have been lost and people have been raped and properties have been looted or destroyed, and we talk about justice. The truth is, it's about accountability. How do we, as Special Advisor Alice Nderitu has pointed out, how do we move on in terms of protection? Well, we need to change the paradigm. And this is why the topic, and please, Carsten, let me know when I've 2 minutes before you want me to zip it, please. The role of international, regional, domestic criminal courts and jurisdictions in investigating and prosecuting crimes. The answer is a new paradigm in which we're each, whether it's a domestic prosecutor, whether it's a regional prosecutor, whether it's an international one, whether it's mechanisms or UN-created entities, we work in partnership. We work with collaboration, and we go away from the idea that cooperation imperils independence. It's nonsense. One can speak to a state party or non-state party. One can cooperate with senior UN officials or UN bodies or prosecutors or mechanisms, and without one jot compromising independence. Otherwise, what do we see? Why suddenly is this idea that we lose independence by working together? How does that gain traction? And I think it requires us, those in leadership, to look at ways in which we perform better. So in the midst of the rules-based system or the utility of public international law seeming to be under threat, I think we are seeing another opportunity because of crisis, because of a realization, perhaps a creeping realization against our own will, and in some cases in the despair of conflict, that if we keep going in this trajectory, it's not only affecting parts of the world that are far away, that may be economically disadvantaged, where they may not be politically powerful, but it affects, and not only Europe, it affects humanity at all, at large, because we do have states with nuclear weapons. We do have a change going on in the world in terms of rising powers and changing orbits of international affairs and economics. And I think this realization, when perhaps it's crystallized even more or dawned with even greater vividness since the 24th of February, that if we don't start holding on to the law and not viewing it as an a la carte menu that states can choose and pick from based upon short-term national interest, we shouldn't just think that countries get richer and the world gets peaceful in terms of our way of life. We have to hold on to this principle. And I think in that context, as President Trendafilova mentioned, the fact that really within very few days, I think 2 days, we had 29 countries refer the situation in Ukraine to the International Criminal Court, and we now have more, of course, is a sign of hope. Maybe a dawning realization, but only if we snatch it now, only if we hold on to it now, and we don't get distracted when the next atrocity or the next crime base or the next genocide or crimes against humanity are committed. We have seen perseverance pay off. We've seen that in Cambodia, we've seen it in the Second World War cases, we've seen it just last month. I opened the case of Ali Kushayb, the first Janjaweed leader that was brought before the judges of the ICC for the judges to independently assess the weight of evidence arising out of the first referral by the Security Council. But it took 17 years, so how do we do better? I think it takes a number of measures. We need to be more in the field. I learnt in Iraq the advantages being in Baghdad, being in Duhok, being in Erbil, going to Sinjar, and having daily abilities to go and engage with the victim communities, going and dealing with the Iraqi authorities, with the regional authorities in the Kurdish region. Yes, it's not, the amount of restaurants are not as extensive as The Hague, and certainly nowhere near Paris, of course, but it allows work to be done. So we need to move to more field-based presence, and I think we're already trying. We have an agreement from Venezuela to have an office in Caracas, have an office in Kiev, and try to have offices in the region. We need to change our approach in terms of this binary choice, and there again with the wonderful leadership of President Ladislav Hamran and Eurojust, we have for the first time been part of a joint investigative team with Poland and Lithuania and Ukraine, in which we can share their information, with realizing that all parties to every conflict have obligation. Nobody gets a free pass. Nobody has a blank check. Every party to hostilities, any regular force or irregular force has obligations to comply. But it allows us to receive information, and we have the option of deciding what we share with the JIT based upon independence and impartiality and our obligations to move forward. We also need to harness technology. So we change from thinking, as Prosecutor Bramett said, that everything can be done in The Hague. We use technology and artificial intelligence, cognitive services, to take larger data sets and then to apply technology to them. So we can not only get stronger cases to put before the judges of the court, but we can actually provide evidence to national authorities. We have now 9 structural investigations going on in Europe, including in France or in Sweden. And then we can support the wonderful work that national authorities like Germany or Sweden or France or Finland are doing to step together. And if we work in that way, hopefully the prayer of Nadia that next time we don't talk about the hope of accountability, we see more of it in action. We see less crimes in the future, because we have a fundamental realization that no one court can effectively deal with the type of crimes that should not be part of the lexicon of speech, namely genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes. And we build, instead of division and blame gaming and saying it's your job or our job, you actually create this common front of legality, and that hopefully will, like the wonderful dikes of the Netherlands, be sufficient to keep away these tides of criminality when they, unfortunately, far too frequently are experienced by the most vulnerable people we have. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Prosecutor Khan. You've drawn attention to field presence, strengthening investigative teams, revisiting technologies, and supporting also domestic jurisdictions as passes forward. We only have 12 minutes for this panel left, so we have to keep it in time. So that it's a perfect transition, I think, to Dr. Zabak to update us on the developments that we've seen.
Thank you very much. First of all, I have to say that I feel extremely honored to be here and to get the opportunity to talk about the prosecution of core international crimes in Germany. I am afraid I might cause a bit of a break in the flow of the discussion, because I will take clearly a micro perspective, getting very specific about our investigations and my office's approach when prosecuting crimes against humanity, war crimes, and especially genocide. When I reflect on our experience on a national level, I think a number of key aspects that play a very important role in most German investigations. Those key aspects I'd like to point out are the initiation of investigations on a broad scale, starting at an early stage of the crimes, the advantages of cumulative prosecution of terrorist crimes and core international crimes, the application, of course, of the principle of universal jurisdiction, and, of course, the need for international exchange and cooperation with other countries, as well as the need for cooperation with civil society, with NGOs, international organizations, and UN mechanisms. Now, I'd like to focus on our Yazidi cases and the recent genocide case in Frankfurt am Main as an example. In August 2014, the War Crimes Unit of the Federal Public Prosecutor General has initiated a structured investigation into crimes against members of the Yazidi religion committed by members of the so-called Islamic State. Right after the attack of ISIS fighters on the region of Sinjar in northern Iraq, we started collecting all the evidence we could get, all the information about crimes committed against Yazidis and ISIS' strategy to destroy the Yazidi religion by using sexual violence against women and girls, killing male Yazidis, forcing Yazidis to convert to Islam, and destroying Yazidi heritage. Legally, the investigation was based on the suspicion that ISIS members were guilty of a variety of core international crimes, such as genocide, crimes against humanity, especially the crime of killing a person, enslavement, sexual violence and torture, and also war crimes. Together with the police, we collected a large amount of witness statements. As some might know, the German federal state of Baden-Württemberg started a humanitarian program in 2014, bringing more than 1,100 Yazidis to Germany, especially vulnerable women and children. We asked them if they were willing to testify within the framework of our investigation, and until today, the federal police and prosecutors from my office interviewed more than 100 Yazidi witnesses. These statements were the most important source of the investigation. Furthermore, the investigation included the evaluation of United Nations and NGO reports. We also asked expert witnesses to contribute their expertise, for example, on ISIS structure and ideology. In addition, one main responsible for the Baden-Württemberg Yazidi program and a known expert for the Yazidi religion was asked to write an expert report. This structural investigation provided an effective framework for dealing with the challenges of large-scale crimes and complex crime patterns, and for dealing with the coordinated attack of a terrorist organization with the agenda to destroy a religious group. After having built up the case within the structural investigation, several investigations against individuals were initiated. Some of them German forest terrorist fighters, some of them ISIS spouses, some of them high-ranking ISIS officials from other countries. Up to now, 5 individuals were convicted for crimes against humanity committed against Yazidis, including one conviction for genocide, which brings me to the case of Taha El-Jay. In February 2020, we charged Iraqi citizen Taha El-Jay with genocide in connection with the ISIS attack on Yazidis. The investigation of the case started in February 19, following the indictment against Taha's wife, Jennifer W., a young woman from Germany who traveled to Syria in 2014 to join ISIS. We had already indicted Jennifer W. For offenses of terrorism and the murder of a slave girl in Fallujah, Iraq, although we did not know at the time who the girl was. The suspicion that she was responsible for the death of the child, together with her husband, resulted from her own account she gave an FBI informant in June 2018, traveling in a car together. With the help of the Yazidi organization Yasta, we could identify the mother of the child, and we interviewed her as a key witness in Germany. The investigation against Taha, who had never been in Germany, was only possible due to the principle of universal jurisdiction, which is part of the German Code of Crimes Against International Law. We located the suspect in Athens, and the Greek police arrested him on the basis of a European arrest warrant. 5 months later, he was extradited to Germany. According to our findings, Taha El-Jay had joined Islamic State in 2013. 2 years later, he married Jennifer W. and bought a 5-year-old Yazidi girl and her mother on a slave market in Raqqa. Both Yazidis had been captured during the attack of ISIS fighters on Sinjar region. El-Jay and his wife kept the Yazidis as slaves in their household in Fallujah. The mother was forced to do the housekeeping. Both Yazidis were forced to follow Islamic rules and were severely beaten on a daily basis. In August 15, Taha tied the child to a window outside the house in the burning heat because he was angry. While the mother was watching, the child died in the course of this punishment. The court proceedings against the defendant started in April 2020 before the Higher Regional Court in Frankfurt am Main. On 30th November 2021, after 17 months and 58 days of court hearings, the court in Frankfurt sentenced the defendant to a life sentence. He found Taha El-Jay guilty of genocide because, with the intent of destroying the religious group of the Yazidis, he caused serious bodily and mental harm to members of the group. Taha El-Jay was also convicted for the war crime of torture and crime against humanity of enslavement, torture, causing severe physical and mental harm, and severely depriving a person of her liberty, and causing the death of a person through these offenses. Furthermore, the court ruled that the defendant must pay 50,000 euro to the joint plaintiff, the mother of the child, as compensation for the non-material damage she has suffered. The defense has appealed the judgment, so it is not final yet. Coming back to the key aspects I mentioned at the beginning, I'd say that the verdict in Frankfurt would not have been possible if it had not been for the recognition and application of all of them. The structural investigation provided us with a large amount of evidence that convinced the court of the genocidal nature of ISIS' attack on Yazidis. Every investigation of Yazidi cases in Germany that led to an indictment started with a suspicion of the defendants having joined ISIS as a member of a terrorist organization. Without the means of cumulative prosecution of terrorist crimes and core international crimes, we would not have had an investigative focus on these individuals. Taha El-Jay could not have been tried in Germany without the application of the principle of universal jurisdiction, because he had no link to Germany at all that would have given us jurisdiction to prosecute. Not a single Yazidi case in Germany would have been successful without effective international cooperation. United Nations and NGO reports were a starting point for the structural investigation. We were supported by other national, states and security agencies such as the FBI and the police in Greece. Victims and key witnesses could be found through the cooperation with NGOs such as the Yazidi organization Yazda. 2 of their members of staff traveled from Iraq to Germany in order to testify in our courts about the work of the NGO and the identification of the witness. During the trial proceedings, UNITAD assisted with the gathering of further evidence. And as the contribution of Yazda and UNITAD was so important for the trials as well as further Yazidi cases we are working on, I might add some words on the reasons why the cooperation was so effective. I would start with the use we could make from existing documentation by Yazda. It was extremely valuable for the investigation that very early after the ISIS attack, statements of survivors were collected and preserved. In the case of Taha El-Jay and Jennifer W., the mother of the child had already reported to Yazda what she had suffered by Taha and his young German wife. At the time of her report in 2017, no criminal investigation existed, so it was obvious that her account was given free from any motivation to be part of court proceedings in Germany. Most parts of the evidentiary proceedings were completed in May 2021, when the defense applied for the hearing of witnesses in Iraq. Furthermore, the defendant produced a document to challenge the charges. Within our framework of mutual legal assistance, we asked UNITAD to check the authenticity of the document, and it turned out that it was completely forged. In other cases...
We're approaching the end of the panel. Can I ask you to come to a close?
Even though she was saying nice things about UNITAD.
In other cases, UNITAD assists in interviewing witnesses who reside in remote areas of northern Iraq. It was extremely helpful for the investigation that they assisted. To end, I would like to add the German perspective on the future of prosecuting and bringing to court core international crimes on a national level. I think I can speak for both war crimes units that we extremely embrace the principle of complementarity and cooperation. In Germany, it has shown that facing the huge task of fighting impunity can only be managed by sharing it. And we are well advised to take up cases where we can work effectively, and we do believe that at the end of the day, we must aim at bringing cases to court. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much. I'm sorry I have to be a strict timekeeper, but I think there's some lessons of optimism that we can draw from the panel, how international criminal justice has brought categories of crimes from the books really to reality. Also how we see new mechanisms like structural investigations in the context of Syria, in the context of Iraq, which asks also the question, how can we strengthen obviously the multilateral structures for these investigations, not only the regional level. So if we want to empower domestic jurisdictions and to take their burden, I think this will be a crucial investment to make in the future. With this, I would like you to again thank our panelists, and then we will move directly to our last panel on reparations for survivors. Thank you.
We will only have a seated break. Of course, if you would like to leave, that is fine, but we have a seated break. We just, in a few minutes, seconds even, continue. Sorry.
You want to do 5 minutes?
Yeah, maybe.
I'll cut it.
So is it okay, 5 minutes?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
Thank you.
You give me a sign
I will.
Yeah. I will do my best.
So we go in the order. Is this okay? Oh, you're here. That's good.
Yes.
So we are a little bit pressed on time.
You can imagine.
Yes.
We will speed.
Maybe.
أهلا وسهلا. فرصة سعيدة. تشرفنا.
No. I can try to make it 5 minutes. If,
yes, around that. I'm sorry for this.
No, it's no problem.
Thank you.
No problem.
Could you take a few photos of Nadia and Kareem, please? Thank you.
The video is set in principle, so once I
just use his scores and it will come just to me.
Yeah, exactly, and then I will go and see. This is my third practice.
Hey, I am what? How are you? Yes? كيفك عادي؟ سعيدة. عافية. إن شاء الله. جيد جدا. لا أول مرة.
Ja, die is even naar het toilet, maar ik begin maar vast, zodat ik jou nog wat tijd kan geven. We gaan het zien, ja. Ja. Ladies and gentlemen, may I invite you to return to your seat so that we can resume?
Guys? Thank you so much. You are so kind.
With a link. Is it in this? Sorry?
No,
it's not in this. I will check it, but it was.
It's here.
Yeah, but it's also over here.
How are you?
Perfect.
Yeah?
No, I speak English.
Yeah. You should start the video then from the...
No, but
From Iraq. Okay.
You have to keep them energized.
Yes.
Always the problem at the end.
Oh, Pete.
Ladies and gentlemen, shall we resume, please?
Moi, je vais dire juste très légèrement.
Monsieur l'ambassadeur, Madam President, Professor Anachi Otto, President of Leiden University, thank you very much for being here with us. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Murad, thank you very much for being here with us today. Thank you for sharing and telling. Thank you for educating us and for instructing us not only to engage in abstract talk but to act. Thank you for taking the lead and for showing us the way. This third and final panel is inspired by you, by your work and the work of your organization. So in panel 1, we discussed prevention of genocide and the establishment of it and the role of UN bodies. In panel 2, we discussed the role of courts, domestic courts, international courts, the ICC. And in this third panel, we are going to speak about victims and survivors. We're going to speak about support and reparation for victims and survivors. Now, we know that the ICC has a special place for victims in its procedures, and in particular also with the ICC Trust Fund. But we also know that the jurisdiction of the ICC and the ICC Trust Fund is limited, and the funds are limited. So there's an urgent need for civil society to fill the gap. And even where the ICC has jurisdiction and the ICC Trust Fund has competence to act, as we have heard, there is a need for close cooperation, because civil society has the closest links to the ground. NGOs are on the front line of providing assistance for victims and survivors. They have special expertise, also in relation to sexual violence and gender-based violence. NGOs explore new ways of finding accountability, new ways of finding reparations, for instance, through the freezing of assets for the benefits of victims. NGOs and international organizations also find new types of reparations, for instance, also for damage to cultural heritage. And here we are very pleased to have a special expertise of UNESCO. So in this panel, we will engage in a journey that cannot stop with the ICC, but that starts sometimes with the ICC, where we see reparation as a space where several actors can come together and must cooperate. We have 3 speakers in our panel, which I will now introduce in turn, and then we will go in a row with the presentations. First, we will actually have a short video on the important work of your organization, the organization of Nadia's initiative. And then we will have an intervention by Mr. Abid Shamdin, the Executive Director of Nadia's initiative, Development Specialist and Yazidi activist. And the initiative, as you will explain in more detail, is dedicated to rebuilding communities in crisis and is engaged in global advocacy for survivors of sexual violence. After that, we will have an intervention of Mr. Rupert Skilbeck, the director of the NGO Redress, of course a central actor a central NGO in the quest to seek justice for survivors of international crimes. And then we will have intervention, and I said we're very pleased also to have Mr. Lazare Elundu Asomo, the Director of World Heritage, UNESCO. Hopefully, if time permits, we will have a Q&A and open the Q&A with an intervention by Mr. Pieter de Baan, the Executive Director of the ICC Trust Fund, who will share some reflections on these cooperations of the different actors involved. Without further ado, I'm going to turn on, no, actually, someone else is going to turn on the video, which we're pleased to show you first. Thank you.
On the morning of August the 15th, following the continued refusal of the Yazidis to convert, ISIL fighters descended. Over the course of our investigation, UNITAD has collected extensive testimonial accounts from survivors. Our forensics team has used a range of technologies to document the environment of Kojo village. Here, you see locations of laser scan capture points that were ultimately converted into a high-resolution 3D model. And through the collection of call data records, we can track the call activity in and out of the village. By synthesizing these assets, UNITAD has pieced together the tragic events of August the 15th, beginning at Kojo School, where ISIL had demanded that all the villagers should report.
When I got to the school, it was already almost full, because most people lived closer than I did.
The school was crowded, with hundreds of frightened villagers.
This hallway was full of people.
Some Daesh members came to us and told us to hand over all our belongings, our gold, money, and phones.
According to call data records obtained by UNITAD, phone activity essentially ends as ISIL confiscates the villagers' means of communication. Once in the school, ISIL separated the men from the women.
The women were put upstairs and there were Daesh fighters at the bottom of each set of stairs.
Sheikh Ahmed Jasso, the Mukhtar of the village, was being held in the main hall of the school. The women who were being held upstairs could hear the activity through the balcony above.
I heard the Daesh member say to Ahmed Jasso, "If all of you convert to Islam, we will not order you to do anything." Ahmed Jasso said, "If I speak for myself, I will not become Muslim, but let me ask my people." Then all the men said, "We will not become Muslim."
Downstairs, ISIL began to remove the men from the school in small groups. The men were taken in groups to a number of sites around Kojo. Many believed they were being transported to safety, to Mount Sinjar.
When we first got in the truck, we thought we were going towards Sinjar Mountain. But when it turned towards here, we started to get scared.
Unknown to them, the men were being collected for mass execution at a number of sites surrounding Kojo village.
Daesh told us to get out of the vehicle and organize ourselves in a single line. We couldn't arrange ourselves in a line as we were panicking and scared, so we held each other's hands. At that moment, all I thought of was my son, because I thought to myself that Daesh would kill our children too. Daesh surrounded us in a circle and were holding PKCs, pistols and AK-47s. In a few minutes, they started shooting at us and we all fell to the ground.
There's the grave. They were shooting from behind until we were all collected there. They lined up and they told us to crouch down like this. That's when they shot us and the planes were flying overhead, and after they stopped shooting, they started killing people over there too.
On August the 15th, hundreds of men, nearly the entire male population of Kojo, was systematically and deliberately murdered. There are 17 mass grave sites in and around Kojo. UNITAD has worked with local authorities and the Yazidi community to identify and excavate all of them. With advanced technology and in close partnership with Iraqi and KRG authorities, UNITAD has ensured that the evidence collected is in line with international standards and incorporated into case files assembled against those responsible. For the women and children of Kojo, the horrors of August the 15th were merely the beginning. ISIL transported everyone left at Kojo School north to the nearby small village of Sola, at the site of a former technical college that ISIL used as a holding area.
Daesh took us to the Solah Institute. It was around 2 p.m. and we stayed there overnight. On the second day, about 10 o'clock, the Daesh members took the old woman outside of the institute.
My mother saw an excavator outside and that Daesh fighters were preparing for the execution.
UNITAD has confirmed that 82 women, 40 years old or older, and 10 boys were executed in this mass grave next to the Solar Institute, which was finally excavated in November 2020 and their remains collected.
After that, they took us, the younger women and children, to a school in Tel Afar.
From Tel Afar, women and children entered an extensive network of human trafficking. Almost without exception, the women ended up in sexual slavery. UNITAD's diverse collection of evidence has enabled the team to identify key perpetrators of the Kojo massacre and subsequent trafficking of women and children. An ISIL payroll roster extracted from battlefield evidence revealed detailed information such as full names and monthly salaries for a number of suspects. One of the principal perpetrators of the Kojo massacre, a man known as Abu Hamza, appears repeatedly. As part of this effort, the team partnered Situ Research to develop a digital evidence presentation platform which will be made available to national authorities. The platform translates the meticulous details of the case brief into a dynamic and accessible repository of evidence that can be presented clearly in court. Through close cooperation with the families of victims, Iraqi authorities and NGOs, UNITAD has also recently supported the identification and return of remains of some of those killed in Kojo on the 15th of August 2014. This represented a profound moment of reflection for the Yazidi community and a small step towards justice for the victims and the survivors of the Kojo massacre. UNITAD is continuing its work with Iraqi authorities in order to identify remains and support their return to their families for proper and dignified burial. The massacres and subsequent enslavement of the Yazidi population of Kojo represents one of the many egregious and brutal examples of violence inflicted by ISIL on the Iraqi people. But it's important to note that such crimes were not limited to the Yazidi community or just the Sinjar region. The crimes of ISIL have impacted all communities in Iraq, whether Shia, Sunni, Christian, Kakai or Shabak. The investigative priorities of UNITAD will continue to reflect the calls for justice from all of these communities. In doing so, we seek to meet the demands of survivors and the families of victims for individual perpetrators to be held accountable in a court of law, thereby building a basis for lasting peace and reconciliation.
I would now like to pass the floor to you, Mr. Chandin.
Thank you so much. I am honored to join this discussion with so many experts, especially a discussion where my amazing wife is speaking and my friend Karim Khan. What you can see, as you saw, Karim was narrating this video. He was the head of UNITAD at the time, and I can tell you from my experience working with Karim, he led with humanity, humility, and dignity. He was someone who included survivors every step of the way and made sure that he navigated very difficult political dynamics in Iraq to make sure that he produced something that can preserve evidence and justice for the victims. What you saw in the video is the work of UNITAD, and obviously Nadia was very essential and important through her advocacy with others, with Amal Clooney and our friends, to establish UNITAD, where their work is very important to preserve and document atrocities against Yazidis and preserve all the evidence that can be used in a court of law in a proper way. But what you saw is just a glimpse of what happened to Yazidis in August of 2014. It's the story of Kojo, Nadia's village, of one village. In 2014, when ISIS attacked our community, it was a planned attack to eradicate Yazidis from existence. And we saw that in their plan, they not only attacked Kojo, they attacked the entire Yazidi community through especially enslavement of women. They used Yazidi women and girls as young as 8 and 9 as a weapon of war and sold them in markets, online, and throughout Mosul, in Iraq, and all of Iraq, and parts of Syria where ISIS had control of those regions, like cattle, like Nadia mentioned in her speech, sold Yazidi women to one another and used them to attract more ISIS fighters from Europe, from Europe and other places, to commit these crimes against Yazidis and other communities. Thousands of Yazidis during those early days of August 2014 were massacred, especially men. As you saw in the video, they focused on killing all the men, separated women from all the men to use the younger ones for enslavement, for sexual slavery. Children were taken into captivity to later be trained and brainwashed. And I'm sure some of you have seen reports and videos where Yazidi children, after they brainwashed them, they joined ISIS, and they used them to attack the community and other communities, because some of them were 7 and 8 and 9 years old when they took them, and they didn't know better. They also focused, as Nadia mentioned in her speech, focused on a systematic plan where they focused on destroying the Yazidi culture by destroying our temples, destroying the poor already education system that existed in Sinjar, to destroy all the schools, the clinics, access to water, and especially farms. Yazidi community historically was a farming community. Because of discrimination of decades, we didn't have much resources in that region, and Yazidis depended on farming cattle for years to make a living and to survive. When ISIS took over the region, they destroyed that entire system that Yazidis had relied on for decades to survive. It was a self-sustaining system that we used, but now all of it is destroyed. ISIS, as you know, many spoke today about it, genocide is not a single event. It's a process. And unfortunately, that process with the Yazidi community started decades ago. And that process laid the foundation for this genocide in 2014 and made it easier for ISIS to target the Yazidi community. How? I grew up in that region, as Nadia did and others, in Sinjar, because of the remote region and because of the discrimination against the Yazidi community. Our community was deprived from resources, access to proper education. Until today, we do not have access to higher education in our region. And that made it harder for Yazidis to educate themselves, and especially women. It was twice as hard for women to access education, because if you wanted to access higher education, you had to travel to Mosul, Baghdad, and other places and live there for 3-4 years. And it's, obviously it was much more difficult for women to do that and to live in another city for that time period. Our region was, and is still always, was controlled by others. Our destiny was controlled by others. We did not have much say in what happens in our region in terms of security, in terms of local governance, and other matters. And that's why the Yazidi community was left weak. When ISIS attacked, we didn't have the means and the resources to protect ourselves, or to flee even. Our own security was in the hand of others. And unfortunately, those that were tasked with our own security fled overnight without informing Nadia, without informing the thousands of Yazidis that were enslaved, that were killed, that ISIS threat is coming and you must leave. They didn't even do that aside from fighting ISIS and protecting us. And so that marginalization of decades from deprivation from resources, deprivation from access to education, local security and governance, laid this foundation. On top of all of that, misinformation about Yazidis, talking about Yazidis being not people of the book, Yazidis being this and that. There still is so much misinformation about Yazidis, and they used that, ISIS used that to, unfortunately, recruit others to join their ranks to attack the Yazidi community. In 2000, I'm told I only have 5 minutes, so I need to transition. In 2003, another event that led to making this genocide possible against Yazidi was the rise of radical groups, terrorist groups in Iraq, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and others, and then later transitioned to ISIS. During that time period, there was so much violence going on against Yazidis, with major attacks in 2007 against Yazidi villages in the south, which was not properly documented as now Untitled is doing. And even the so-called international coalition that was there at the time marginalized Yazidis, because they focused on areas where they wanted to stabilize those areas, of course. In Sinjar, and the Yazidi community never had any involvement in terrorist activities. So therefore, by definition, and I worked with the coalition forces, and I know I have firsthand information on this, that Yazidi areas were already stable. So this whole process gave a chance to ISIS to commit these atrocities against the Yazidis. With all that, I will give it to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, I sincerely apologize for limiting you in this way. Thank you for your account and for exposing the roots and for deepening our knowledge on your community and what has happened to them. I would now like to pass the floor to Mr. Gilbert for his perspective on the work of redress in seeking justice for survivors and victims. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here as Redress celebrates its 30th year acting on behalf of survivors of torture to bring justice and reparation. We're based in both The Hague and in London and work with survivor groups and partners all around the world. The right to reparation is well defined in international law in the UN Basic Principles on the Right to Reparation and Remedy. The key element of it that is often missed is the survivor participation. And I think in the video on Untitled, we saw a really good example of how you can have survivor participation in a justice process. So what you need to do when designing a reparations program is to ask the survivors what they want. And it's often different depending on the situation, who the group is, what the specifics were. But there are 5 elements to it. I have to write them down because I always forget one of them. The first is satisfaction, which is primarily justice. For many survivors, the fact that a court says someone is responsible is almost the most important thing. Non-repetition is incredibly important. Many survivors say the most important thing is that this never happens to anyone else again. Sadly, we cannot make that promise. It will happen again, but we will try and make it more difficult if we possibly can. There's a need for rehabilitation, and there are experts who deal with medical intervention to help survivors rebuild their lives. There's a need for restitution. Nadia told us very carefully earlier about the importance of rebuilding communities and that restitution that is part of it. And there's also a need for compensation, and that is needed for all of the above. We're in a curious situation at the moment where there are warlords, dictators, war criminals, and their enablers with vast amounts of wealth, while their survivors have nothing. The current war in Ukraine makes that incredibly clear. So let's talk a little bit about money. Reparations funds exist, but many of them do not have any funds. The International Criminal Court Trust Fund for Victims has funds, but it could have an awful lot more. The trust fund set up by the African Union for the victims of Hissène Habré, who was convicted before the Extraordinary African Chambers, has no money to give to survivors. The Khmer Rouge Tribunal didn't make any reparations orders because it had no money to do that. So for survivors, one aspect of the right to reparation is theoretical and illusory rather than practical and effective. And as good students of human rights law, you'll know that that doesn't work. But things have recently changed. I had the privilege to represent Sergey Magnitsky before the European Court of Human Rights on behalf of his widow and his mother. He was the same age as me. I never met him, of course, but I read thousands of pages of what he had written in his case. And what you see in that case is a burning desire for justice and a determination to find the truth. Sergey sadly didn't make it, but we see that same determination and desire for justice in many of the survivors we work with. But in his name, a new mechanism has been created in Europe and around the world that allows sanctions to be issued for human rights violations. Using that, in the last 2 months, billions of dollars and euros have been seized. The sale of one football club in London would be enough to cover the entire budget of the Yugoslav Tribunal, the Rwanda Tribunal, and the International Criminal Court for their entire existence. We're talking about very large amounts of money. States have been looking at how to repurpose those funds where there is a nexus between the funds and the violation that took place. Our hosts in France passed a law last year that allows for bien mal acquis, ill-gotten gains, to be seized following on the conviction of Théodore Obiang for criminal offences and the seizure of hundreds of millions of euros of his assets. Similar laws have been passed in Switzerland. There's a draft law in Canada. The United States and the United Kingdom are considering such laws. Those funds could be paid into existing trust funds, such as the International Criminal Court Trust Fund for Victims, which already have the expertise and the architecture to deliver the reparations that is needed. This is a huge opportunity that we have at the moment. It must be done carefully. The rule of law must apply. The rights of the parties must be respected. It cannot be arbitrary. But if there were a concerted effort from other countries in Europe, or indeed the European Union, to introduce repurposing across the continent, all at once, we could perhaps make the promise of reparations a reality.
Thank you very much for highlighting the 5 dimensions of reparations, but particularly paying heed to the urge of Ms. Murad of operationalizing things and effectualizing the right to reparation through this innovative way of using targeted sanctions. Thank you. I'm now going to quickly pass the floor to Mr. Lazare Elundu Asomo, the Director of World Heritage of UNESCO, for his intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Larissa. Allow me to speak in French, as I'm the last one to speak. So it will also give you the time to put your headset. Ce que je voudrais dire très rapidement, c'est que c'est vrai, À l'UNESCO, nous ne travaillons peut-être pas sur cette question de la compréhension du génocide et de son processus, un peu comme on l'a entendu, mais nous travaillons sur quelque chose qui est un aspect similaire, qui est celui de la destruction des masses, de la culture et du patrimoine. On a vu tout à l'heure dans la vidéo, de Nadia Initiative, on détruit cette entreprise d'éliminer physiquement, mais aussi de détruire les villages. Et donc de détruire les villages, de détruire la culture, de détruire les références culturelles, de détruire les identités. Et c'est ça aussi ce qui rend très difficile le relèvement des survivants. Et c'est là essentiellement le travail que l'UNESCO essaye de faire. Et c'est cette mission que nous avons essayé de mener ensemble avec la communauté internationale à Tombouctou, où 14 mausolées des saints ont été détruits, où il y a eu des conséquences énormes, où des manuscrits ont été complètement brûlés également. C'est ce qu'on a vu aussi dans d'autres pays, c'est ce qu'on a vu en Irak, à Mossoul et un peu ailleurs. Et on s'aperçoit effectivement que en détruisant le patrimoine, souvent les adversaires cherchent à attaquer une communauté ou des hommes considérés comme rivales ou porteuses de valeurs un petit peu différentes et affaiblir les bases de leur force, de leurs identités, de leur cohésion sociale. Et en fait, de les nier comme êtres humains complètement. Et c'est ça la force de la culture, c'est qu'elle contribue aussi à la réparation pour les survivants. Et c'est elle qui aide aussi, on l'a bien vu, pourquoi dans le projet de l'initiative Nadia, il faut reconstruire les temples, il faut reconstruire ces éléments, parce que ça aide les victimes à remonter. Et c'est ça effectivement qui est important. Mais ça démontre aussi en quoi la destruction du patrimoine représente plus qu'une perte du joyeux du passé, du patrimoine de l'histoire, et que ça devient finalement une question de sécurité et de paix internationale, parce que ça déstabilise complètement les rapports humains, ça prône la radicalisation et l'extrémisme violent, et ça éloigne les perspectives de réconciliation et de paix. Et c'est ce que je voulais essentiellement dire aujourd'hui. Et ce que nous avons essayé de faire à Tombouctou, ensemble avec le bureau du procureur, où pour la première fois, quand j'ai conduit cette mission en 2013 personnellement, j'ai demandé à un expert du bureau du procureur d'être avec nous dans la première mission en 2013 à Tombouctou, quand nous sommes allés découvrir cette masse terrible de destruction de tous les mausolées qui a laissé cette communauté de Tombouctou exsangue complètement. C'était important de coopérer avec la Cour pénale internationale, avec le bureau du procureur, pour construire les preuves et comprendre pourquoi la destruction du patrimoine était si importante et avait créé un traumatisme si fort pour les communautés de Tombouctou. Et c'est ce qu'on voit aussi pour les communautés yézidis et pour bien d'autres communautés un petit peu partout dans le monde. Et je pense que ce que nous essayons de faire aussi, que nous avons fait, et je voudrais remercier le bureau du procureur, je voudrais remercier le Fonds pour les victimes, avec cette réparation pour les populations qui est importante. Et ce travail, il faut le continuer. Il faut le continuer à travers des actions de coopération qui sont importantes, comme ce document de politique qui a été élaboré par le bureau du procureur, qui est important pour la destruction du patrimoine, parce que, je voudrais terminer là-dessus, il y a eu un mot, l'impunité. Il ne faut plus que la destruction du patrimoine soit considérée comme quelque chose qui ne mérite pas d'être puni. Et c'est pourquoi c'était aussi important ce tribunal, cette condamnation de Almadi Al-Faki, qui a permis de reconnaître que la destruction du patrimoine est un crime de guerre. Et je crois que c'est important que cet aspect de la culture aide les survivants du génocide. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Elundu, de partager avec nous ce que fait l'UNESCO dans le contexte de réparation, dans le domaine de réparation, mais aussi spécialement la mission à Timbuktu et les contributions à la réparation de la culture là-bas. We have now some final minutes, a few minutes I'm very happy to say, for Mr. Pieter de Baan, the Executive Director of the ICC Trust Fund, to share some reflections. Maybe I can invite you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not on the program, but I'm all the more privileged to be able to speak to you. I'd like to start by acknowledging the presence of Ms. Nadia Murad. Your presence here is inspirational. It's indicative of what is resilience, what is perseverance, what is advocacy, and it is, I think, a humbling experience to be here with you. Because as Prosecutor Khan says, it really reminds us and it burns in our soul the responsibility that we have at our institutions to persevere in the accomplishment of accountability, but related to that also in the accomplishment of reparations. There's been a lot of talk about accountability on this day of impunity, and oftentimes also recently this term is used in relation also to the suffering victims. And what I would like to posit here, that accountability is incomplete if it doesn't have a reparative component. It's really truly important innovation of the Rome Statute to have reparations as a cornerstone. And you could say reparations are also a jewel in the crown of the ICC as a whole. Brings a big responsibility. We've heard from the panelists, and I'm happy to note that the panelists in this one have been quite efficient in their time and really going to the point of the matters, talking about the funding of reparations as truly important. If you don't have that, it remains an empty idea and it remains an empty promise. And it's our responsibility to ensure that that's not the case. What is also important to understand that reparations, if you unpack that, you will see a couple of elements that you need to take care of. Justice is an international public good. Reparations are a public good. And who is judging if it's well delivered or not? Who is judging the value of justice? It is the victims. It's those who've been at the receiving end of victims. The quality of justice at the ICC, at the other courts, the quality of reparations is not in the documents, it is in the experience of the victim survivors who will tell you whether or not justice has been delivered in the courtroom or to their doorstep in terms of reparations. That reparative value is not something tangible, it is something that needs to be measured in different ways and needs to be carefully assessed before you can conclude that you have been successful in your enterprise. And it is not an abstract issue. It is an institutional responsibility, but it is a human enterprise. So reparative value is part of the paradigm of reparations. And the other one, we talked about space. Reparations is a negotiated space as well as justice. You have seen the negotiation happening around the Rome Statute where reparations came into being as a central element of international criminal justice. You've seen the first judgments on reparations coming about as an outcome of a procedure in which you have different parties playing a role, but the real negotiation, the real engagement about reparations to make it meaningful has to be with the involvement of victim survivors. They need to have the agency to tell you what kind of reparations will help them to overcome the harm that they've suffered. This is what we have been doing in the different cases where we have been implementing as the Trust Fund in Katanga, in Al-Mahdi, in Lubanga, and this is what we are aiming to do also in the Yongwing case. What you see is that reparations orders, the subsequent reparations plans, they change over time because victims, as they're being identified, victims as they're being engaged in the program, they have an influence on the shape of the awards. They have an influence on how and in what manner and at what pace the reparations awards are being implemented. And that is, I think, an essential understanding that we get from our implementation practice, that you cannot prescribe reparations. You cannot parachute them from The Hague into the communities. You need to have a constant conversation with victim survivors to make sure that there is value in reparations to them, and this value is actually in relation to the harm that they've suffered. I don't have much time. I'd like to keep it here, but I think this conference has been extremely important to highlight also that reparations is part and parcel of the promise of justice. That needs resources, but it needs also expertise that is not only inside your own organization, with your partner organizations, outside of the Rome Statute system, to make sure your understanding of reparations is how do you say that, is synchronized with the expectations that victims may have from you and the satisfaction that they may seek to derive from your activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. De Baan. Thanks to all the panelists, Mr. Shamdin, Mr. Skilbeck, Mr. Elundu Asomo, and Mr. De Baan, who was our Q&A and panelist in both, for offering this tour d'horizon from the ground, from the NGO perspective, from international organizations' perspective, from the ICC, all the actors that have to work together to meet the call that was done so urgently to us at the beginning of this session, this event, not to have further events, but to have action. And I think that can only be done by collaboration. So thank you very much for joining forces to move towards that goal. Thank you very much. I would like to invite you to remain seated. The Prime Minister will arrive in 1 minute or so, so we're very well in time. I apologize for speeding up the panel, but I think it was a very, very informative and deep panel, so thank you.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege and honor to welcome Mark Rutte, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. Mr. Prime Minister, it's an honor that you take the time to be with us here today, to return to your alma mater, to provide the closing remarks for our special event today, particularly also to honor the initiative of Nadia Murad. So many thanks for the French Embassy for the cooperation. We are very grateful that you join us here today. The floor is yours.
Well, Ambassador Vassy, distinguished guests, Mrs. Murad, you once said, when genocide is committed, it must be seen. People must look at it with open eyes and not minimize its impact. And this is so true, because holding regimes or individuals accountable for acts of genocide is often a difficult and painstaking process. It demands constant attention, lots of patience, and even more perseverance. During that process, it's crucial to keep pushing forward by telling the stories of the victims over and over again. Because visibility, knowing what happened, and also telling the world about it is key to accountability and justice. This is true for the Yazidi people, who suffered terribly at the hands of ISIS. Your sisters and brothers, Mrs. Murad, who have been given a powerful voice through your words and actions. Sending out the message that justice must include the healing of the psychological and also emotional scars caused by sexual violence. It's true for the Rohingya community in Myanmar, who were driven from their homes, raped or murdered in the devastating and violent campaign orchestrated by the Myanmar military in the summer of 2017. And as we speak, it's also true for the people of Ukraine. There are more and more indications that Russian troops are using sexual violence as a weapon of war. Violence aimed not at military targets, but at innocent civilians, mostly girls and women. There are also indications of deportation, torture, and cold-blooded executions. So the discussions you have had this afternoon are both necessary and highly topical. And I thank you, Ambassador Vassy, and the French government for organizing and hosting this event. The bottom line, of course, is that humanity has to triumph. We have to make the wheels of justice turn. We have to show what justice can do, as a warning to perpetrators and potential perpetrators, but also to give a voice to the victims and recognize their suffering. We all agree on this. We all say it. And yet we all know that saying it is easy and doing it is extremely hard. The long road to justice begins with knowing the truth. And the truth can be established only through independent fact-finding and evidence-gathering on the ground. I want to express my deepest respect for all the organizations and brave people who take on that task, despite the many dangers and despite the great personal risks involved. And I believe that governments also have a role to play here. And that's why the Netherlands is sending a team of experts to Ukraine to investigate possible war crimes. It's essential that we, members of the EU, and France was one of the first to work on this, but also the international community as a whole stand shoulder to shoulder in this regard from day one. And we are doing this in the case of Ukraine, firmly, without hesitation, and leaving no room for doubt. Because here in The Hague, legal capital of the world, we have seen how hard it can be to get all the evidence presented at trial and ensure that justice is done. It takes resolve. In fact, it also takes enduring resolve. So constant attention and ongoing action are needed. We owe it to the victims of genocide. We owe it to those who live in fear of persecution today. And we owe it to the future. And these are grand words, but I say them with reason. We owe it to the future of humanity. So thank you for all your contributions to this important event today. Thank you for your countless endeavors in the fight against acts of violence and genocide. And let me assure you that this country, the Netherlands, always has been and always will be at the vanguard on the road to justice. Thank you.
So this closes the event for today. Thanks to all of you for joining us, I think, for these inspirational sessions. We hope that many of you will return in the future, and also downstairs there might be further opportunity to gather. So thank you.